Early in the morning, loud sounds were heard over the military camp. The guy hit the frying pan with a ladle and shouted, "Rise." The man lying on the bed did not want to open his eyes. He heard perfectly well that his neighbors had already woken up and were getting up. One of them swore that a beetle had crawled into his boot at night and almost bit him on the leg. The man opened his eyes with a sigh. "It's very noisy here, you won't be able to sleep." His name was Encrid. He is the commander of a squad of guys who were exiled here for their antics. They were all dangerous and reckless, but when Encrid sent them to attack, they became excellent fighters. Encrid did not have any special strength or special talent. He knew his dream was too far away. He got here thanks to continuous training, which helped him a lot in battle. But it was here that he met his end. The enemy turned out to be much stronger than him and knocked the weapon out of Encrid's hands. The guy tried to reach his sword. He succeeded and again ran into the thick of the battle, covering himself with a shield. He managed to notice the arrow flying at him and dodged it. The arrow hit his opponent, even though everyone around him laughed at him and said that he wouldn't succeed. But he believed. Who still holds the sword in his hands? He will definitely become a knight. Even if this dream was worn out in battle, but an enemy blow with a sword interrupted his life and dream forever. Encrid did not believe that his life ended so quickly. He had no idea that his death would be so meaningless. He fell into a dark whirlpool and his eyes closed, and again he opened them from familiar sounds. Someone commanded the rise. The sun was shining brightly. What a real dream he had. The neighbor on the right shouted that there was a bug in his boot. Encrid turned around at his shout. Is this déjà vu? A few hours later, he again fought with the enemy, and the second time he received a fatal blow with a sword. This happened on the third day, and on the fourth. Every time it's the same, and again the morning rise. Everything is unchanged, but he remembers how the enemy's sword pierces his throat. The pain of being burned alive, the blood pouring out of his body. Again the same battle with the enemy. Again the troops stand opposite each other, and hatred is reflected in the eyes of the soldiers. This day repeats itself all the time. Perfect sword thrust. Encrid sees the edge of a sword in front of him for the 17th time, and experiences his 17th death. If only he was a little better with a sword. If he had put in more effort, maybe he wouldn't have died here again. He sees the blue light again, and hears a voice in a dark whirlpool. The figure in the boat, holding a lantern in his hand, asks if he really thinks so. Let him flounder, feel it to the bone, and then surrender to despair in front of an insurmountable wall. Encrid's face contorts with impotent anger, and he wakes up from the annoying blows of the ladle on the frying pan and the shouts of "Rise." He had no decent words left. The neighbor is surprised that his squad leader woke up so early today. Encrid gloomily tells Ram that he has a bug in his boot. Ram looks into his boot and shakes out a large beetle. Stupid jokes from the commander who put it there himself. Encrid grumbles that he just saw a beetle crawl into his boot. This is the 18th time he sees this picture with the beetle. How long does he have to watch her before this day ends? Encrid opened the curtain and went outside. He had been practicing with the sword since childhood. A mercenary who accidentally wandered into his village taught the boy fencing. He often told Encrid that with this level of skill, the boy could become a knight, and Encrid began to dream about what future awaits him. A knight is someone who alone can kill 1,000 and change the course of a battle. Invincible hero. The minstrel song said that the knight who would end the war would be called the Knight of the Apocalypse, and little Encrid thought that he was the hero from this song. He decided to leave the village and become a knight, but not everything worked out the way he dreamed. After leaving the village, he joined a detachment of mercenaries who laughed at his clumsiness. They were mortified that a guy who was afraid of ordinary mongrels was going to become a knight. He won't even make a free mercenary. Encrid was silent, but privately realized that his talent was probably worthless. But he convinced himself that it was too early to give up after one failure. You need to put in more effort. He trained with the sword day and night, and if you don't have talent, then with work and time you can overcome everything. So he grew up in continuous training, without stopping it for a single day. Experience accumulated, he developed strength and endurance in order to be recognized. He felt that he was becoming stronger, and could become a knight. And this ardent hope suddenly began to shatter into pieces. A village boy challenged him to a duel, and successfully disarmed him and stabbed him in the stomach with a wooden sword. The weak guy got caught. The boy was 12 years old, and he said that he had been holding the sword for only 6 months. All the years of Encrid's work, all his calluses turned out to be nothing compared to the young genius. All Encrid's efforts were in vain. He thought in despair, is there really another way to become a knight? Nothing came to his mind except to train even more. He chopped down the tree with all his might, investing all his rage and desire to achieve his goal. But there were a few minor cuts left on the bark. Well, if he doesn't turn out to be a knight, then at least he can become an experienced soldier. So he thought while attacking an innocent tree. 3 years later, it is now Cypher's Division, 4th Battalion, 4th Company, 4th Platoon. Encrid became the commander of a detachment of the so-called rabble. This was the best place for him, obtained through endless training. The kingdom's regular army is still better than traveling mercenaries. Encrid left the tent and turned to his subordinate Jackson, who was whittling a stick with a knife. He asked to replace him on the morning shift today. Jackson looked displeased at the commander and muttered that he would owe him. Ram noticed Jackson's displeasure, but Encrid made a request to him too. He wants to learn the heart of the beast again. Ram recalled that Encrid had already tried to learn and gave up. Does the guy think he can succeed now? The skirmish between Norelia and Aspen began again. In this battle, Encrid died and began to live the same day, coming to life again and again, dying and being reborn. Every day he learned from Rem the heart of the beast, but until now he could not even see the moment when the tip of the sword pierced his throat. He really hoped that today everything would definitely work out for him. The troops were lined up in combat columns. The 21st time Encrid found himself on the same battlefield. He fought as before. He remembers by heart all recurring situations, so he dodged the spear that was flying at his back. Then he attacks the guy standing behind him. But Soldier Vel from another squad is running. This guy is going to die soon. Shoot an arrow at him. We can say that he has already died. But not this time. Encrid intercepts the arrow with his shield, covering Vela. And here is his future killer, dealing with another soldier. He pulls his sword out of the lifeless body and looks for a new victim. Encrid will have an inevitable meeting with this guy. He'll stab the guy in the throat like he's done 20 times before. But this time Encrid will survive. His eyes are determined to fight to the end. During training, Ram said, throwing his axe high, that Encrid always closes his eyes at a dangerous moment. The axe was in his hand, and Rem brought it closer to his commander's neck. At that moment, Encrid closed his eyes, which in battle was tantamount to death. Ram inspired him to be brave, not to worry and not to panic, to become a person who does not know death. Like a beast, this is the heart of the beast. Encrid finally met the deadly blade flying towards him with open eyes. Now he is not afraid of death. It makes him stronger. And he managed to move away from the blade to the side and break the distance with the enemy, who by inertia continued to run forward. Today, on his 21st attempt, for the first time he dodged the attack of the enemy, who turned around and repeated his attack. But the guy missed the moment when the blade hit him in the neck again. Blood spilled in a stream and he died again. In the flickering darkness, the figure in the boat said that he was suffering and despairing, stuck in the endless today. He needs to give up and get on the boat. Admit your weakness and come to terms with it. Encrid told the damned boatman that such a day would never come. He saw the tip of the sword clearly and was able to dodge. Again, Ram was surprised that the commander woke up early today, and Encrid was glad that he was moving forward step by step. On the 22nd day, he challenges again. Everything went as usual. By the 33rd time, Encrid could already clearly see the blade. He could dodge a fatal blow without much difficulty, but the enemy still could not turn faster than he could. The enemy was too fast, and Encrid, bleeding, fell to the ground again. The sword cut the thread on which the medallion hung around the guy's neck. Looking at the medallion lying on the ground, Encrid remembered that when he was a mercenary, he received an order to destroy several monsters. It was not a required job, just a request from the villagers they were passing through. But the guy helped them anyway, because his dream was to become a knight, and a knight must protect the weak. The village head thanked him, but the village was poor and they had nothing to give the guy except an amulet. It was a ridiculous reward for risking one's life, but the headman said that this thing could fulfill one's deepest desire. With fading eyes, Encrid looked at the amulet and wondered if all this was really happening because of him. So he could become a knight? But the guy was still alive, and his opponent decided to strike the final blow to save him from suffering. Show mercy. Encrid understood that there was no question of any mercy. In front of him was just a sick bastard who liked to kill. He was awakened by the sound of a gong. He immediately stood up and told Ram that he had put a beetle in his boot. Ram decided that the commander was completely out of his mind, that he was making fun of the soldiers like that. Encrid paid no attention to his grumbling. He simply told Rem to come out and watch Encrid perform the heart of the beast. They went outside. Ram swung his axe and attacked. Encrid bounced away from the blow and closed the distance. He successfully dodged back from the second blow. Ram seemed puzzled. Just yesterday the commander could not make a single correct move. It is impossible to train like that in one day. He couldn't learn their clan's secret technique from someone else. This is literally a feeling gained through death. Encrid did not spend much time explaining that he was constantly training. What difference does it make? He still succeeded. He took the sword and invited Ram to fight. Ram happily accepted this offer. Even if a person mastered the heart of the beast without a decisive blow, he would simply be killed. Encrid attacked his opponent. He deftly dodged blows with an axe. But Ram was not satisfied with the fight with an opponent who was constantly dodging. He rushed to attack. Encred dodged again. The only thing he knew now was Valen's sword technique. This is a custom swordsmanship supposedly created by the mercenary Valen. Some disparagingly call it cheap tricks. From what he has, this is the most useful. Encred stabbed his opponent with his sword. The sword flew out of his hand, and Rem barely managed to dodge the flying blade. For a moment, Encred imitated his killer's thrust. He died from it dozens of times, and his body remembered how to apply it. Ram noted that the last attack was the most impressive of all that the commander showed. But he lacked aggression. Ideally, after such a blow, blood should have come from his hand. Encred thought that this attack should not fail. If she is blocked, what should he do next? Ram advised to think that the enemy will not be able to evade, and firmly believe that the enemy is already a corpse. Then Encred will definitely not drop the sword. It was a shitty explanation, but Encred understood. There was a big difference between the enemy's attack and Encred's attack. On the battlefield, this was decisive. There was no confidence in the guy's sword, which is why he died so many times, and the enemy dealt him a blow of mercy. He attacked Ram with a readiness to stab and then kill, but the sword flew out of his hand again, and again he was killed by his enemy. The situation repeated itself every day, and every day he trained with Ram, moving forward step by step. The 111th day passed without changes, like all the subsequent ones until the 124th day. On this day, it was especially difficult for Ram to repel the commander's attacks. His last attack almost killed the soldier. Finally, the sword remained in Encred's hands. Blood flowed from his hand that was holding the sword. Ram decided that the commander had gone crazy. His arm was torn and bleeding heavily, and a smile bloomed on his face. He finally mastered the thrusting blow of the bastard he met on the battlefield. In the evening of the battle, Encred moved very quickly, putting all his killing desire into the blow. His opponent defended himself, but missed the blow with the sword. The helmet saved him. They engaged in a fierce battle, and blows rained down one after another. The first attempt to pierce the enemy's throat failed. Encred received his blow to the neck. He was bleeding, but he didn't close his eyes, and he did not let go of the sword from his hand. He was defeated, but boldly looked into the eyes of his opponent. He again said that he saw how painful the enemy was, and was about to strike a blow of mercy. Directly looking at the blade of the sword, Encred clearly said that tomorrow his enemy would die. The killer laughed. For those who die now, tomorrow will not come. And he pierced the young man with a sword. Encred's amulet shone in the glittering darkness, and again the military tent, and again the beetle in Ram's boot. Encred asked him to watch for him this morning. On the 125th day, Encred asked the soldier to get him greaves, a shield and a dagger. He will pay for all this later. He took the commander at his word, although he usually did not lend anything. Puzzled, Rem didn't remember Encred asking for anything like that before. The soldiers did not understand what happened to their commander today. This guy is very strange today. He's usually not so bloodthirsty. Encred's eyes burned with grim determination. Every time he was wounded and died, he felt terrible pain. Even if he challenges tens of thousands of times, can he win? What if he finds a way to survive? Will it continue today when he wakes up? Or will there still be tomorrow? Now he is stronger than before. Maybe that's enough? Maybe he should give up. But no, he will not give up and will overcome this wall. Repeating this day, he comprehended the heart of the beast and mastered the piercing blow. He will never refuse such a gift from heaven. For the battle, he put on new armor and armed himself more powerfully. It's time to take it one step further. On the battlefield, trumpeters sounded the start of the attack. Encred walked ahead of his squad. The battle he had seen many times before began. Cause. The reason Encred, deprived of any talent, survived on the battlefield was preparation, luck, and composure. He did not always die at the hands of his opponent. On the 46th day, a guy with a spiked club crushed his shoulder. On the 47th day he dodged, but another enemy smashed his head. But now Encred struck first in a turn. On the 71st day, a soldier who fell to the ground cut off his leg, and he became powerless against the enemy. Now Encred deftly walked around the fallen enemy and finished him off. On the 89th day, an axe thrower split his skull and the guy died. If you leave the thrower alive, he will interfere in the fight with the main maniac piercer. During all these days, Encred learned to throw, so there were no problems. The enemy was defeated quickly and accurately. Finally, Encred saw Vel, who was about to die from the arrow. He covered Vel with a shield, but a sniper nicknamed Eagle Claw should appear, and Encred has no time to deal with him. And then comes the moment when the guy meets his wall, an enemy who loves to kill people. They met on the battlefield, as they had met many times before. The enemy struck with his sword, but Encred repelled him with his shield. The guy understood that he couldn't win with dodging and lunging. Before him is a simple soldier, but he is very strong. These people are called geniuses. Encred blocked the blow with his sword. The enemy wanted to catch Encred in the attack and find a gap in his defense, but he simply began to block his blows. He closed the distance and hit his opponent with his head in the body. The unconventional technique of the Valenian mercenary sword was effective against the enemy. The enemy made a familiar stabbing blow to the guy's throat, but he already habitually evaded. Now he knew everything about this piercing blow and swung his sword towards his opponent's blow. The blow was so powerful that the enemy's sword broke into small fragments. At that moment, the Eagle Claw sniper fired an arrow, which flew over the heads of the combatants. Encred's opponent dropped the broken sword, and fear flashed on his face. Encred was sure that he had now won. He did not see that the arrow was flying straight into his back. A suddenly thrown axe cut the arrow and interrupted its deadly flight, and Encred's sword plunged into the enemy's throat. Ram, who threw the saving axe, wanted to kill the sniper, but he had already changed his place. Encred's opponent slowly fell to the ground. Encred spoke the words he had heard countless times, "I will show mercy." He swung his sword with force and cut off his opponent's head. He overcame the wall, which he had stormed for many days. It shattered brick by brick. At the same time, a monster jumped onto the battlefield and Encred barely managed to run away. The guy's face was distorted with frustration and anger. How unlucky. His subordinates ran as fast as they could to help him. Frog entered the battlefield. Frog knocked Encred to the ground with one blow. The guy could only growl with rage and resentment. The frog looked at the soldier's corpse and noted with bitterness that it took him a long time to raise such a fighter. How did it happen that he lost to such a non-entity? He drew his saber and charged at the prone Encred. The guy realized that he was about to die, but Rem blocked the blow of the frog's sword with his axe. He attacked the enemy very suddenly, and the monster could only defend himself. Frog threw away Ram's axe and broke the distance between them. He struck strong and randomly with his sword, but could not touch his opponent. The fighters stopped opposite each other, looking for their opponent's weak spots. Encred still had not come to his senses, and did not notice how an enemy soldier ran up to him, who intended to pierce him with a spear. Jackson ran into him from the side and, without further ado, cut off his enemy's head. Encred was saved again. The battle between Ram and the frog continued. Ram mockingly said that without his permission, no one can break their commander's neck. Frog was surprised that the squad leader was not the excellent fighter with whom he was fighting, but the weakling who was lying on the ground. Ram was in a difficult position and realized it. Frogs are a fighting race, born for battle. It can only be burned with magic or pierced through the heart with one blow. But Frog also assessed Rem's fighting qualities well. He understood that to kill him, he would have to risk his life. Rem showed with all his appearance that the frog's reasoning about him was correct. He will not give up on his goal to kill the enemy. Frog decided that this battle was not worth the risk, and retreated. The battle continued, and Jensen, after helping his commander, fought several opponents. Severed heads flew in different directions. The other members of Encred's squad did not lag behind him, and cut down the enemies with all their might. Together, they made up a well-coordinated deadly team that no one could defeat. Finally, after a few hours, the troops were ordered to retreat. At night, Encred again found himself in the darkness he was familiar with, in which a voice whispered that he had lasted one day, but that was all he could do. He will not be able to withstand the walls that will appear further. Disappointment and despair are the guy's fate. The boatman looked intently at his face. Encred barely rose to his feet, and shouted that for him these walls existed to be overcome. He looked straight at the creature in the boat, and his eyes burned with determination to win. The boatman laughed. He is looking forward to the moment when Encred's eyes, full of greed and ambition, completely dim. Encred opened his eyes. He lay covered in bandages. He recognized the medical tent. Sitting next to him was Ram, who told the commander that he had slept for 2 days in a row, and he proudly reminded that he saved the guy from that frog. Encred stood up and coughed, pressing his hand to his chest. It was a miracle that he survived the collision with the frog. Ram looked sideways at the guy and asked if he remembered his best friend. That is him. Encred answered with difficulty that he and the aristocrat hunter were not friends. Ram quickly covered the guy's mouth with his hand so that no one else would hear him and asked him to keep quiet. Why does he talk about other people's secrets? Encred took his hand away from his face and asked Ram to choose friends or strangers. A new day has begun. Encred survived and yesterday is left behind. A fighter from his squad, Kreis, demanded that the commander pay him in full. He spent a lot of money to put him in a medical tent. Encred himself was surprised that a simple soldier was placed in such comfortable conditions. He replied to Kreis that he was not visible on the battlefield as usual. The region remained silent in response. Then he broke into a smile and reduced the amount of debt. The next one to enter the pataka was Jackson, who silently looked at Encred. Without further ado, he threw a healing potion onto the bed, and he came out saying that it was necessary to smear it morning and evening. And don't let the commander ask where he got it. Encred opened it and saw that it was Jackson's personal medicine, which he usually did not share with anyone. The next fighter, Odin, wept bitterly at the bedside of his commander. Encred assured him that he had not died and was not going to, and Odin left the tent. Night fell, but Encred could not sleep. What kind of show was there today? Usually all his subordinates were not so sensitive and always minded their own business. He closed his eyes, but another of his fighters, Ragna, came into the tent and wondered why the commander was lying in the medical tent. He looked at Encred and left without a word. Encred noted that Ragna was fine. As before, he doesn't care about anything. The next morning, the guy saw that there were 2 more people lying in the tent besides him. A platoon commander from another company, who always attacked Encred with his fists and now cursed him for the fact that the guy was staring at him, and an unfamiliar soldier who just stared into space. The guy looked like a private. How could a private get here? Suddenly all the patients' eyes turned to the entrance. An elf dressed in armor with pointed ears entered the tent. She was looking for the commander of the 444th Detachment. Encred looked at the new guest in bewilderment. The brute asked gloomily what the elf was doing in the medical tent. The elf asked what unit he was from. He said that he was the commander of the 3rd platoon of the 2nd Company of Benzins. The elf asked, "Is it customary in his company to name the race when you see a senior in rank?" Benzins lowered his head in embarrassment and apologized. Encred decided that the elf was apparently the new commander of the 4th Company. He said he was the man she was looking for. The elf looked at the guy carefully. They say he copes well with his difficult subordinates. She looks forward to his further success. She was about to leave, but as if she had seen something, she turned to the young soldier and asked what his name was. He hesitated, and after a pause replied that his name was Krang. Encred immediately realized that the guy had just come up with this name, and he behaved strangely. Maybe he's from the nobility? The elf left the tent without saying a word. Encred watched her go. In the evening, Encred examined himself. The pain was almost gone and training could be resumed. Benzins called out to him and asked where he was going. Encred replied that he was going to the training ground. Benzins thought that this idiot was trying too hard and was just an ordinary soldier. Krang did not engage in conversation. He kept looking into the emptiness in front of him. On the sight, Encred began to remember the previous battle. This is one of the few useful techniques he learned as a child, at great cost. He remembered his last decisive blow, which struck his opponent. What if this attack failed? Was it right to bet everything on this blow? If he failed, he would die again. To make every blow as deadly as Ram's axe, you need to hit with all your might, but think through every movement. His training was interrupted by a voice. The man said in surprise that Encred was training very hard. Encred turned around and saw Krang, who, as if nothing had happened, continued that he did not understand what Encred was doing. In the barracks, he was just waving his hands, but now he's in the clouds with a sword. Encred explained that this was training for his grip strength, and now he is remembering the last battle. Krang still didn't understand why Encred needed this, and the guy angrily replied that it was necessary so as not to die. Krang asked what would happen if he didn't die. Is there something he would like most? Encred looked thoughtfully at his interlocutor. What does he want to become? The dream that everyone laughs at is worth talking about. A dream, the limits of which he had already reached due to the poverty of his talent. He waved his sword and said that he wanted to become a knight. Krang's eyes widened. He didn't expect this, but he didn't laugh. It was the first time Encred had seen a man who did not laugh in response to his frankness. Krang got up and walked towards the barracks. Looking at Encred, he realized what to do next. As he was leaving, he turned around and said that when Encred becomes a knight, let him not forget the name of his friend. His name is Krang. This is how Encred first received support. Near the medical tent, a minstrel surrounded by soldiers shouted songs. Benzins was yelling that breakfast still hadn't arrived. Encred woke up with a headache, and instead of the training ground I went for a walk. On the way he met Jackson, who asked how his wounds were healing. Encred said the medications were working well and thanked Jackson. Jackson replied that the best gratitude is the commander's speedy return to duty. When Encred went to bed, he thought he had had a very quiet day. The next day, Encred woke up to the sound of the same minstrel song as yesterday. Benzins again shouted about the lack of breakfast. What a noisy guy. A thought flashed through Encred's head that made him freeze with horror. He went out into the yard, and Jackson asked him again how the wounds were healing. And Encred again replied that the medications were helping, and thanked the guy. Jackson replied that the best gratitude is the commander's speedy return to duty. The day was exactly the same as yesterday. He suddenly remembered a dream. The boatman said that the wall would block his path again. Let him try to survive. Was he really killed while he was sleeping? Encred found himself even more helpless than on the battlefield with the psycho who killed him in battle. But he was filled with determination. It's time to challenge again. At the end of the day, Encred wondered who could have killed him. For the enemy to get here, you need a force capable of breaking through all the protective walls. To do this, you must be at least a knight. But this is impossible, which means this is the work of an assassin, and there is a high probability that the killer is one of his own. Someone who knows the location of the medical tent. He knows how to hide his presence well and is skilled in murder. Quiet and agile elves are suitable for this. Did the elf really come that day to scout out the place in advance? There is only one entrance to the medical tent. He will not sleep, and as soon as he sees someone, he will scream and wake up the soldiers around him. Something stabbed him hard in the neck. Poisoned needle. He didn't even see who released her. Encred could neither move nor speak. He couldn't call for help. It was a strong, paralyzing poison. That's why he didn't remember the first time he died. Benzins was lying on the bed, and a poisoned needle was also sticking out of his neck. He was dead, and near Krang's bed stood a figure in a cloak with a hood that hid her face. The assassin raised his sword high above the sleeping Krang, and he stuck it into the guy's body. Encred could not do anything. Krang died before he could understand anything. A sword cut the wall of the tent, and another man in a cloak with a hood entered. With his fading consciousness, Encred noticed the pointed ears under the hood. He turned out to be right. One of the killers was the company commander. Encred greeted the third such morning in heavy silence. Yesterday he was very attentive, but he could not even sense the approach of the killer. It won't be easy. In addition, the company commander is involved in the case. Even if he could stop the first killer, he would still have to deal with her. The situation seemed completely hopeless to the guy. He's felt this feeling countless times, but in the end he won and cut off the head of his enemy. Having reassured himself with such thoughts, Encred left the tent. If he doesn't give up, he will win now. In the evening, armed with a sword, he tore off the blanket from Benzin's, and he shouted that his neighbor had gone crazy. The enemies had not yet penetrated inside, and the best thing to do was to monitor the perimeter. Benzin's asked indignantly, "Is the guy's training today to chase cockroaches with a sword?" Krang entered the tent, and was surprised that his neighbors were all arguing. He can leave if he prevents them from sorting things out. Krang entered and Encred thought. Judging by the way the killers acted, they came for Krang. The guy is very suspicious. Who is he really? Encred did not meddle in the personal affairs of his colleagues, but now he was drawn into the assassination attempt. He turned to Krang, and he asked directly who he was. The guy did not expect such a question and looked at Encred in surprise. Encred regretted asking so directly about personal information. His communication skills are zero. Krang hesitated and said that he could not answer this question. The situation is a little complicated. Even Benzinsk became interested in this and sat up on the bed and listened. He suddenly yelled that the guy was making fun of him. His manners are not like the locals. Let him speak honestly. Is he a spy for another country? Krang looked at Benzin's with wide eyes. He slowly said that he would never betray the kingdom. In his gaze and in every movement, Encred felt the impressiveness of a knight. Krang walked towards Benzin's, and he sat down on the bed and muttered that he was disrespectful to his superior. Encred thought about it. Krang is definitely not a knight. He is as helpless before the killers as they all are. But there is something about him that definitely puts him on the same level as them. Finally, everyone calmed down and went to bed. Encred noticed that Benzin's was afraid of Krang and became very quiet. He looked at the opening in the tent and thought that soon a killer would come in and everyone would die. This thought kept him awake, and he got out of bed, clutching the sword in his hand. Benzin's, who was also still awake, asked why the hell the guy was hanging around here. Encred replied that a killer would come here soon, and if the guys want to survive, then they need to cooperate. Benzin's decided that Encred had lost his mind and turned on his side. Krang was already sleeping peacefully. Encred expected such a reaction and prepared to leave. But a blade pierced his neck and blood sprayed out. The killer appeared suddenly, and having dealt with Encredom, also cut Benzin's throat. But the killer was tormented by one thought. How did this bastard guess about his plans? In the blink of an eye, he jumped up to the sleeping Krang and finished him off with his sword. Encred died again and woke up to the singing of a minstrel. Fourth day. There will be a killer here, but he has no evidence to convince the neighbors. From now on, he cannot count on the help of Benzin's and Krang. We need to inform the authorities and call for reinforcements. The bosses reacted as expected. The subordinate is crazy. Let him shut up quickly. Encred then decided to predict when the killer would appear and scream right before it. He was waiting for the right moment, but the poisoned arrow pierced his throat again, and instead of screaming, he could only make a quiet wheeze. There was no way to get help from outside, and the next day Encred decided to set up an ambush and attack first. But he could not fight an invisible enemy. The poison needle also found him at the entrance to the tent. Encred understood that while he did not see the killer, he saw right through everything here. He was killed again now from behind. He couldn't dodge the poison needle, so he would die without lifting a finger, and this thought depressed him. Encrid greeted the 20th morning in complete despair. There was not a drop of progress in his endless day. He pulled himself together and set the task of dodging the needle first. We need to find a way to react faster to an attack. He walked past Jackson, and I remembered that Ram called Jackson a treacherous lynx. He went to Ram and asked why he gave Jackson such a nickname. Ram responded because Jackson is a vile pervert. You can count his face-to-face battles on one hand. Jackson prefers to hit the back and run. So it turns out that he is an insidious perverted lynx. Oncred thought he couldn't take Jackson with him to catch the killer. This is a wall that he must overcome himself. So he must become Jackson. He directly asked the guy, if someone like him hits him in the back, what should he do? Jackson was taken aback by this question and was speechless. Then he looked directly at the commander and frankly answered that he did not know. He had not seen anyone who had survived. Now Encrid was dumbfounded and speechless. So they looked at each other. After a moment of silence, Jackson finally said that you need to have eyes in the back of your head. Encrid was even more taken aback by this statement. He was at a loss for words. In what sense are the eyes in the back of the head? Is this bastard messing with him? Jackson, without turning around, asked if the commander saw the cart. Encrid didn't even understand what he was talking about now. Jackson was talking about the cart behind the barracks. Encrid looked closer. There in the distance was a cart. How can Jackson see so far? Also with your back? Does he really have eyes in the back of his head? Jackson said without turning around that the cart was about to break down. Before he could say this, the wheel of the cart fell off and it began to fall, almost crushing the soldier who was dragging it. Oncrid decided that Jackson was a prophet. He stared at the guy with respect and surprise. Jackson was taken aback by the commander's conclusion. He just has sharp hearing. He heard a sound. It was the joints of the cartwheels rattling. If you listen, you can predict what will happen next. For Encrid, everything that happened was a revelation. He couldn't even hear that the cart was moving anywhere at all. He realized that you don't have to use your eyes to notice something. Jackson advised the guy that if he wanted to practice, he should keep listening. You need to sharpen your senses and carefully catch sounds. Jackson explained everything in great detail, and before he would get mad if Encrid asked him something. Jackson replied that he now saw that the commander was not going to give up, and it was better to explain everything to him than to constantly endure his pestering. So the second wall that Encrid faced was invisible death. He will survive if he feels it. The guy lay in bed with his eyes closed and listened to the sounds coming from the street. The measured steps of a patrol soldier, the crackle of a burning torch on the street. Where is the sound of the killer's footsteps? And he had already flown over the wall and landed near the tent. Encrid listened intently, but could not understand where the sound of this bastard was. So in silence, the poisoned arrow pierced his throat. Of course Encrid failed again. What a disappointment. He tried so hard. The morning was gloomy with the singing of the minstrel. No improvements were expected. But his body clearly remembered the training experience when he mastered the heart of the beast and the piercing strike. He went back to Jackson and repeated the conversation. This time Jackson told him in detail that sound alone provides a lot of information. You can determine the location based on direction and volume. And if you learn to catch distant and quiet sounds, then Encrid's ears will be no different from a new pair of eyes. Sound is a wave that is reflected everywhere, even in complete silence. From hundreds of different sound waves woven into a complex pattern, you need to pick out one single wave. They were talking among a large number of soldiers who were talking with each other, doing different jobs. And the courtyard was full of different sounds. Encrid closed his eyes and began to listen, distinguish sounds and catch them. There's the sound of flags flapping in the wind. Here is the sound of one big flag. How many flags are there in general? 7 or 10? Soldiers' footsteps are heard. 3 are close, 2 are far away. With his eyes closed, he can clearly feel the waves, the familiar sounds that he heard every day, and alien unusual. The bird flew up to the flagpole. His training was interrupted by Krang approaching. He asked familiarly what Enki was doing here. Encrid did not understand this address to him, but Krang replied that Enki was a very cute shortened name for Encrid. The guy decided not to protest Enki, so Enki. He replied that he was not training but just sitting. Krang noted with a smile that Enki was not one to waste time. And again the arrow pierced Encrid's throat. Again he saw the killer stabbing Krang with a sword. He had already seen all this 33 times. On the 34th day, the killer jumped from the wall into the barracks courtyard. Encrid again did not hear his steps. Krang was killed and Encrid was defeated again. Lost? Lost. He knew that to overcome the wall you don't need a reason. You don't need random insight or God's help. You just need to repeat the training. Repeat without stopping. Listen to sounds and learn to distinguish them. The bird lands on the flagpole. This sound reminds me of something. Isn't that how the killer lands in the barracks courtyard? Encrid suddenly opened his eyes and scared Krang standing in front of him. He didn't expect Enkrid to see him while he was sneaking up on him. Is Enki training to sense presence? He's not one of those who just sits around. This dialogue has been repeated for many days. On this day, the killer took out his deadly arrow and threw it into the throat of the sleeping guy. For the first time, Enkrid was able to dodge and the needle stuck into the pillow. He pulled out a sword hidden under his pillow, and he attacked the bastard, who flew back and fell on the floor of the tent. Enkrid, sword in hand, prepared to repel the killer. Now he could clearly see his ugly face, distorted with rage. Now before him is not invisible death, but a man made of flesh and blood. The killer could not recover from anger. These little rats somehow figured out his plan. He attacked Enkrid, who recoiled from him. Praney noted that in direct combat, this guy is a couple of levels lower than the idiot he killed on the battlefield. It is quite possible to cope with it. Who can support him? Benzins is dead, and Krang is still alive. He woke up and already grabbed his sword to run to the rescue. But you can't relax. Before them is a high-class professional killer. Enkrid again dodged his opponent's blow. The killer threw a blade at Enkrid, and the guy leaned back. The blade flew very close to his head. He could not stay on his feet and began to fall. At this time, the elf cut the wall of the tent and went inside. Her gaze was stern and did not bode well. Enkrid realized that if he did not strike first, he would die, and he attacked the newcomer. The elf took her sword away and calmly looked at the guy running towards her. The killer waved his hand and released a large number of needles. Enkrid saw needles flying towards him and Krang. An elf also appeared on their way. Krang tried to fight off the deadly stream of needles with his sword. The elf jumped high almost to the ceiling of the tent. She waved her cloak and all the needles pierced it. Krang was saved. Enkrid thought that she was in league with the killer, and she was protecting them. It didn't matter now. Enkrid was not going to miss his chance. Taking advantage of the elf's intervention, under the protection of her cloak, he attacked the killer. He was waiting for his attack with a sword in his hand, but Enkrid quickly knocked the weapon out of the enemy's hands. The killer realized that it was time to escape and headed for the exit. He moved so fast that when he ran outside, there was no one there. He returned to the tent, where the confused Krang and the elf stood. Krang said the killer came for him. Enkrid already knew this. Who would send killers to small fry like him or Benzins? The elf confirmed Enkrid's conclusions. She looked at the guy who was thinking well and took the hilt of the sword. Enkrid realized that despite the fact that the elf was their ally, she wanted to destroy the witnesses. It seems that it is impossible for anyone to find out about the night incident. He too drew his blade and prepared to resist. At this time, Krang told the elf that he did not want anyone else to die that night. The elf bowed in respect and hid her sword. Krang said that apparently Benzins was still alive, and he wanted him to stay alive. The elf replied that she had an antidote. Everything will be all right. Krang thoughtfully said that the tent needed to be cleaned up. There would be problems if they found out that the killer had come here. But the destruction is too great. Enkrid looked at the lit candle and replied that there was an easy way. A few minutes later, the medical tent was on fire. The fire flared up more and more. Everyone ran to put out the fire under the command of their superiors. Enkrid carried Benzins out of the tent. Now there is no trace of the killer to be found, and then let them figure it out for themselves. Krang and the elf walked through the forest. She noted that if it had not been for the squad leader who detained the killer, Krang would have died. She asked if Krang changed his mind because of him. He replied that yes, and this commander is a funny guy. Krang remembered seeing Enkrid in training, his simplicity and diligence. He thought that Enki had greatly influenced him, and a smile appeared on his face. He left the forest and thought that someday he and Enkrid would meet again, each in his own role. The boatman told Enkrid in the dark that they would meet the killer again. The guy was ready for this. He was ready for all the nasty things the boatman had in store for him. Enkrid experienced the same thing again today, survived an invisible death, and greeted the morning of a new day. Now his hearing was so acute that he heard every movement, but he could not yet hear the presence of the elves. He decided to train until he dropped. Fortunately, he was not injured and could return to duty. Benzins gloomily asked why he pulled him out of the fire. Enkrid thought that as much as Benzins didn't like him, he didn't even like saving lives. He simply answered because they are comrades. Do you need any other reason? Benzins thought that only a spineless bastard would save the one who spoiled him a lot of blood. He said that if Enkrid returned to the squad now, there would be a bad atmosphere in the trenches. There was a rumor that there was a curse on the trenches. In Enkrid's detachment, life was in full swing. Ram was fighting with yet another colleague who called him a stupid monkey. All the rest did not interfere with the hot hand. When the commander is away, these idiots always get so mad. They enthusiastically punched each other in the face and knocked down several tents. Things got to the point where Ram grabbed an axe, which caused panic among those around him. His opponent had a sword in his hands. No one dared to separate these psychos. Enkrid did not know what the curse was in the trenches, but his subordinates were the real curse. He approached the fighters and muttered for them to stop. He didn't die from his wounds, so now they want to finish him off with their behavior. The next morning, Ankrid opened his eyes and saw Jackson coming from the tent. He was surprised. He walked out quietly. Did the commander really hear him? Ankrid stood up. He was going to training anyway. Jackson noted that the commander had greatly developed his hearing in such a short time. Let him continue in the same spirit. This will help him as a squad leader. Ankrid was doing push-ups on a tree branch. Winter will soon come, and there will be fewer battles at the front. Thanks to this, soldiers will have more free time, and this is a good moment for training. His subordinate Odin, who was doing push-ups with a huge stone on his back, wished him good morning. He dropped the stone and said that a trained body is like a shield. You need to be ready to withstand even the blow of a frog. And the commander, despite his constant training, is still very fragile. Ankrid thought that compared to the huge Odin it was. One began to talk about his training method, but was interrupted by noise coming from the tent. These two idiots are at it again. They fought as if they wanted to kill each other. Now they did not share the duty schedule and grabbed swords. Ankrid and Odin entered the tent in the midst of a fight. One noted that nothing can be solved by brute force. Ram complained that Ragna wanted to starve everyone to death. Ankrid told Ragna how to carry out his duties as an attendant. The guy sighed heavily and replied that it was only out of respect for the commander. Ram growled angrily. Ankrid realized that the guys simply had nothing to do, and their hands were itching. He suggested that Ram go to the training ground and fight. In the battle, he immediately missed several blows. This delighted Ram. The commander is a rare weakling. He attacked with great aggression, and Ankrid had difficulty blocking his blows. Sparks flew from the weapons. Ankrid remained calm with the power of the beast, and listened and blocked the blows by ear. In addition, he always remembered the piercing thrust with the sword, which Ram dodged by bending backwards. With one hand he caught Ankrid's sword with an axe, and with the other he grabbed his face. It was impossible to get out of this stranglehold. Ram thought that the commander had become stronger, but everything was predictable and boring. These blows of his are already boring. Does Ankrid know anything new? Ankrid was completely exhausted, but was not going to give up. He will be able to move forward no matter what. Let Ram attack. This time he will smash it to smithereens. Ram thought that the commander had very poor skills. But the surprising thing is that looking into his eyes, Ram doesn't get bored. He grinned and warned that Ankrid should only try to touch even the hair on his head. At this time, thunder sounded and it began to rain, which turned into downpour. The fight ended due to natural reasons. Ankrid stood in the tent, looked at the rain and was bored. The evil Cranes entered the tent. His deals have already fallen through several times, so he will soon begin to believe in curses. Ankrid asked about the curse, and Cranes replied that the guy had not heard rumors about the platoon leader. Ankrid remembered that Benzins had also spoken about the curse. Cranes continued that the weather was strange. Fires and injuries were becoming more frequent. Especially in the reconnaissance squad, Jack, Vel, Rotten, and many others suffered. This is what they called a curse. Of course, these are just rumors, but the weather changes all the time and no one knows how to explain it. Ankrid believed that the command did not need ridiculous rumors at the base, and would soon stop all this. Everyone had nothing to do, and Odin said that if the commander wants to train in the barracks, then there are many ways to strengthen himself even while sitting still. And Ragna offered to show him how best to hold the sword. Ram looked at his comrades, and realized that they saw in their commander the same thing that he saw during their training. Their commander had changed a lot in a very short time. There was a meeting at headquarters. Company commanders were ordered that their soldiers keep their mouths shut. Before the onset of winter, we need to send a reconnaissance detachment one more time. Are there any suitable soldiers to fill the empty spots? The elf proposed the candidacy of commander of the 444th platoon. The boss thought about it. He remembers this idiot. He's a little out of his mind. He'll just get in the way during reconnaissance. The elf thought the opposite, that a guy can bring unexpected results. When asked what her confidence was based on, she replied that she had developed intuition. The next morning, she called Ankrid to her place and said that he was being transferred to the reconnaissance detachment. This had the effect of a bomb exploding on Ankrid. He couldn't believe it. Ankrid was packing his things. Cranes asked in surprise why Ankrita was chosen by the company commander. Ankrid wondered, was it really because Krang left that the elf decided to kill the witness? Although this is unlikely. Ram asked if Ankrid was really going there. If he doesn't want to, he can refuse. He pulled out his axe. Ankrid replied that he could not cut off his boss's head with an axe, and if Ram goes instead, it will be even worse. He already has drives. One of them was sobbing in the corner, and asking why such a fragile little precious commander was being taken away from them. It was unusual for Ankrid that everyone was so worried about him. Ragna said that he could go instead of the commander, which caused confusion among everyone. Ragna never wanted to go into reconnaissance. Jackson noticed that the bullets were scouting in the long grass. If Encred hears an unusual sound among the rustling grass, let him be attentive. This is the preparation base for a surprise attack. Ram exploded. This bastard is teaching the commander dirty tricks again. Encred thought that without him, they would all fight again. But if he thought about it, it would be best for him to go on reconnaissance. After joining the army, due to his mediocre skills, he was constantly transferred back and forth without being given a clear position. And the only place where Encred could find any use was the position of commander of a rabble detachment, which everyone refused. He managed to deftly break up fights among his subordinates. Like now, when he wedged himself between Jackson and Ram, who were ready to kill each other because of Ram's careless words. The opponents dispersed in different directions, grumbling dissatisfiedly. Encred understood that these guys, although they behaved like this, were very capable. They could not be lost, and he was precisely the gap in the defense. Therefore, he must go on a dangerous mission. There is no need to realize this. The guy knew his abilities better than anyone, and he should have tried harder. The reconnaissance squad left the camp. Reconnaissance teams explore the front lines. The most important thing is to train vigilance, fearing the enemy. Encred's thoughts were interrupted by a rude shout, so that the commander of the rabble would not have his head in the clouds. The commander of the intelligence department, Andrew Gardner, shouted that he was in charge here, and if Encred wanted to object, let him defeat him in battle. Encred was ridiculed. Will the rabble commander be able to resist? He doesn't even know how to hold a sword in his hands. Andrew called Encred a mediocre idiot who only holds his position thanks to the fighters. If he attacks, you will have to hold back so as not to hurt him. But there was no time to quarrel. Andrew Gardner ordered the enemy fighters to kill on sight. They made such a noise that Encred realized that the commander of the reconnaissance detachment was completely inexperienced and was not sure whether this reconnaissance operation would be of any use. Suddenly Andrew discovered wildebeest tracks on the ground. He happily offered to follow the trail and have a barbecue in the evening. Encred rolled his eyes. Wildebeest usually travel in herds of 20 individuals. The guy wants to take them out with this squad? What is he even thinking about? One of the soldiers said that these were gazelles, not antelopes. He turned to Encred and said that their commander really liked to show off. The soldier's name was Henri. Henri was a hunter from a mountain village, and it seems that he did not like the current commander. He approached Encred to talk, and they quickly hit it off. The hunting wisdom that Henri willingly shared was very useful. As a result, they spent the whole day chasing non-existent antelopes, so the reconnaissance turned out to be a waste of time. Finally, they arrived at the place. This is the Green Pearl, a place that their reconnaissance team must check. It is also known as Dinofoot Grass Meadow. The squad entered the thick grass. Andrew set out to cross the thickets, find the scouts from Aspen, capture them, and distinguish himself. Henri was unsure of the plan. They were only supposed to reconnoiter the area and not enter the thicket, but the commander's order is not discussed, and everyone resignedly began to carry it out. Wading through such thickets is not an easy task. Encred thought Andrew would give in quickly, but there were no complaints. The commander was serious. Henri noted that there was little animal droppings here. It was strange that there were no animals in such thickets of lush grass. After a second, they realized why this was so. There was a roar, and they saw a clawed paw. The huge panther began its hunt. She aimed at Andrew, who was walking ahead. Encred threw the commander to the ground and shouted for everyone to fall down too. Arrows whistled past the soldiers' heads. Following the panther, enemy soldiers armed with crossbows appeared. The reconnaissance squad began to rapidly retreat, but the soldiers were breathing down their backs. They were getting closer. The reconnaissance detachment found itself surrounded on all sides. There was nowhere to run. With his heightened hearing, Encred heard the click of the crossbow's release. What he learned from Jackson was definitely useful. The guy was able to dodge the arrow, but it was impossible to dodge 10 arrows, and they all pierced his body. Encred died at the scene. This day had to be lived through. Of course, knowing about the enemy's ambush, in theory you need to bypass it. But in response to Encred's advice, Andrew promised to cut off the guy's head right there. Encred realized that he would have to survive alone. Nobody will believe him. He tried to retreat by a different route when they were again ambushed, but the enemies surrounded him again. The next time he went east, but ran into a detachment of 20 crossbowmen and died under their fire. When he escaped from the crossbowmen to the north, he was surrounded by spearmen. This also ended badly for him. Another time he hid from his enemies in the thick grass and tried to escape unnoticed, but they pursued him to the end. Encred examined the enemies while he hid. They were dressed in camouflage uniforms. They are difficult to notice against the background of grass. The guy became interested. What are they protecting so much in these thickets? Through the grass, he saw a camp with some rather tattered aspen flags flying above it. Before Enkrid had time to think about what the enemy was hiding here, an Aspen soldier crept up from behind and plunged a sword into his back. The commander again shouted that they would enter the thicket and find the scouts from Aspen, take them prisoner and distinguish themselves. Enkrid thought gloomily that they had come in dozens of times already. Once you go there, you won't come out alive. The Aspenites are definitely hiding something. We definitely need to find out what. He hesitated and let the squad pass in front of him. Henry called him. Enkrid at this time thought that he needed to find a way not to die and complete this day. He is not going to retreat before another wall. Commander Andrew called out to the gaping guy. Everyone needs to hurry up. Enkrid is tired of listening to brainless orders. He told the soldier next to him that there was a limit to the stupidity one could endure from this idiot. Do the soldiers really like to obey this commander's son? Enkrid had no intention of putting up with this anymore. Andrew Gardner grabbed his sword. This is disobedience to an order. Enkrid decided it was time to radically change his approach to the situation. He couldn't survive alone. All that remains is to use the abilities of all the squad members to survive together. There is no disobedience. Now he will give the orders. The commander's face changed with anger. But Enkrid understood that Andrew Gardner, along with Henry and that soldier, was one of the most tenacious and skillful guys. Especially this fighter. Enkrid managed to make sure that he fights just great. He is the strongest in the squad and follows the boy commander. Apparently he is his bodyguard. Andrew Gardner said that the only way his command could be taken away was in battle, and he drew his sword. Enkrid assessed his opponent. An ordinary soldier will not have bodyguards, and his sword stance betrays quality training. Judging by the lack of experience with such combat prowess, this is a spoiled young master from a noble family. Although on the other hand, he would not be so eager for a reward. Maybe he is an impoverished nobleman? At this time, Andrew showered his opponent with a hail of insults. He has an undeserved rank and fights lousy. Pathetic guy. Enkrid understood that in any case, following such a commander was a lost cause. Andrew became more and more enraged every minute, and shouted that he had a mission that he must complete. Enkrid lazily advised the guy to shut his mouth and attack. Enkrid doesn't even need a sword to defeat him. Andrew rushed to attack his subordinate. Andrew Gardner had skill, but he underestimated his opponent. Underestimation led to carelessness. Enkrid did not even draw his sword, but simply stood in the path of his running opponent, clenching his fists. He batted away Andrew Gardner's sword with his hand. I closed the distance and struck him with my fist, from which Andrew doubled over and fell. The soldiers gasped. Knock out a commander with one blow? And this was done by an ordinary low-ranking soldier. Enkrid informed the soldiers that from now on, he was in command of the intelligence department. Does anyone have any objections? No one had any objections. The soldiers received the news of the change of commander gloomily. The first step to ending this day had been taken. They entered a thicket of tall grass. While they were walking, Enkrid asked Henry what his dream was. The soldier replied that he wanted to marry the flower girl and run the household. Enkrid noted that to do this, we need to get out of here alive. He turned to another soldier, and he replied that he had recently had a child. Other soldiers said they wanted to save money and open a shop, or simply return home to their native land. Andrew was silent for a long time, and suddenly said that he must fulfill his mother's last wish. His dream and mission is to revive the Gardner family. Enkrid knew that all this was possible if they stayed alive and returned to their camp. Now all fighters must act on their own initiative. There is no better motivation than the thirst for life. Until now, when an enemy appeared, the squad tried to break through it. Now Enkrid gave the order to Henri to shoot to the side at the height of a human head. Henri did not see the target, where to shoot. Enkrid was persistent. He repeated the order again. Henry fired, and the arrow hit an enemy soldier in the head. The ambush was discovered ahead of time. Enkrid rushed at his enemies, drawing his sword. He ordered Andrew to follow him. Andrew, cursing angrily, hurried after his new commander. Enkrid attacked enemies from behind and hit them in the back with a sword. To gain an advantage, he decided to be the first to attack the ambush. His sword was stained with blood. They managed to take the enemy by surprise. The Aspen commander ordered the killing of all attackers, but he himself died from the blow of Andrew's sword, which attacked him from behind. While the enemies were confused by the surprise attack, it was necessary to quickly reduce their numbers. One of the enemies was sneaking up on Andrew from behind, but he was killed on the spot. They simply cut his head off his shoulders. Along with the rest of the soldiers, Enkrid fought against the enemies, and the chances of a successful surprise attack increased. Of the 12 enemies, 8 remained. The remaining Aspenites were in a panic. They called for help. Enkrid gave the order to his squad to destroy all opponents. The soldiers rushed to the attack and killed several more enemies. In this tall grass, it was difficult for the Aspenians to determine the location of the detachment. However, there was a reason why they discovered him last time. A panther came to the scene of the battle. An Aspen soldier tried to spear the beast, but Encred jumped out of the thickets and finished off the soldier himself. This beast that Encred saw in his first death. The enemies were chasing the panther and accidentally discovered their reconnaissance squad. This time they were also chasing the beast and did not immediately discover that they were also being hunted. In gratitude, Ecknerd decided not to kill the panther. His subordinates finished off the remaining opponents. Encred gave the order to move forward. This time, after the recent battle, 6 people left the squad. They lost 1. It was impossible to save everyone, no matter how many times this day repeated. But this time, the majority survived. As the day repeated itself, Encred knew where and what groups of enemies were located, and disarmed the sentries. At the fork, he knew that if he continued going straight, they would be destroyed by a squad of crossbowmen. It's better to bypass them. Encred decided to eliminate the detachment of spearmen, who had pursued them very stubbornly the last time, in advance in order to facilitate further advance. Thus, avoiding difficult battles, quickly attacking and retreating, they broke through the enemy encirclement. Andrew struck the enemy left and right. Encred told him not to strain himself too much. When it gets dark, they will not be able to find an escape route, and they need to get out of these thickets before dark. They continued on their way. Andrew said they were going behind enemy lines, but Encred knew that was the right direction. Let them follow him. The bodyguard looked gloomily at the commander. He put a sword to Encred's throat and demanded to tell the truth. He is not going to face certain death, and will kill him here if necessary to find a way to salvation. Encred calmly replied that the soldier himself should understand that it was too late to return. They left such a trail in the grass that the enemies had probably already blocked all escape routes. The bodyguard didn't understand. Now you just have to go to certain death? Encred took the hilt of the sword at his throat. He made it clear that he also wanted to live. Andrew Gardner listened to the new commander and thought he had misjudged him as useless trash. At first he resembled Andrew's father, who squandered the entire family fortune and died, giving up everything. But he was wrong. Rather, Encred embodied all the traits that Andrew Gardner wanted to have. Become the person who shows everyone the way, the trustworthy leader who confidently says that they will all survive. Andrew said loudly that he believed Commander Encred. In response to the indignant cries of the mutinous soldier, Andrew said that the commander's orders were not discussed. Encred crouched down and said that from now on, until he gives the signal, everyone should bend down and quietly follow him. He came up with an escape route to escape this day. The first stage is to avoid being surrounded by the enemy by attacking first and breaking through. Now it's time for the second stage. The detachment walked carefully through the thickets of grass. Not far from them, they saw spears rising above the grass. A large number of enemies were walking there. The reconnaissance squad hit at the only point that Encred found after dozens of repetitions. Only at this time and only in this place. They could let enemies pass without intersecting with them. Everyone hid and waited for the enemies to pass by them. So far, everything has gone according to Encred's plan, but it was still dangerous. Now it's time for the last stage. The sun will soon set and there will be complete darkness. Encred led everyone to the final point of his route. Henry did not understand at all what they should do here. Why did they come here? All the soldiers were shocked by what they saw. Encred led them to the enemy's camp. Encred replied that Aspen's army kills everyone who enters the grass to keep what they are hiding in the camp a secret. Something was fenced off in the middle of the camp. There were bloody bones lying around. What if the enemies have more important things to do? How to catch a reconnaissance squad? Encred gave the command to follow him. If their plan works, they will have an escape route. The detachment entered the enemy camp. Encred told his plan, which outraged the bodyguard. What does it mean to set fire to an enemy camp? Is the commander crazy? They are in the very center of the camp. They can be surrounded and killed at any moment. Encred finally asked the bodyguard's name. The guy replied that his name was Mac, and Encred told Mac that he would not tolerate insubordination. Mac tried to argue something, but Andrew told him to shut up. Andrew Gardner understood that at a time when the road was not visible, he needed to rely on the commander's intuition. Encred tore open the wall of the tent and they went inside. There was no one in the tent. Encred led his men towards the exit with a confident step. Only Mac thought that the commander was completely crazy, but it was strange that he moved too freely around the enemy camp. But despite such manipulations, their squad did not encounter anyone. Judging by the distance they have traveled, they should already be at the exit of the camp. Encred led the people to an area surrounded by flags and told them to wait here. He had already penetrated here dozens of times, and when he first discovered and touched the flag, all enemy forces concentrated on it, guarding this flag. So protecting this flag is the Aspen Army's priority. What will the enemies do if this flag lights up? Mac looked gloomily at the commander and wondered how he even knew about the existence of the flag. Did the company commander really tell him? After all, she was the one who appointed this idiot to the intelligence department. He suddenly seized command and recklessly penetrated into the center of enemy positions. All this for a secret mission. Encred, meanwhile, said that if the flag caught fire, the enemies would rush to defend it, and in the meantime they would run away from here. From that moment on, they split into two groups. One would distract the enemy, and the other would set the flag on fire. Mac took over the role of bait. Encred was surprised that he was dissatisfied all the time, and then became accommodating, but he did not focus on this. Encred hoped that this day would be better than all the previous ones. He had a good feeling that this time everything would work out. A stone thrown by Mac's well-aimed hand flew into the sentry's head. The sentries chased after the intruders, and Mac ran away as fast as he could. Encred rushed to the torch, which was left unguarded, and grabbed it. Now everything will definitely work out. It's time to move on to tomorrow. Suddenly, a huge figure appeared from the darkness next to Encred. With one blow of his sword, the enemy cut off the shaft of the torch and it fell uselessly to the ground. Encred barely had time to jump away from the next blow. The guy stopped opposite the enemy. He was sure that he had not heard any footsteps. It appeared completely silently. In all his days, he had never met such a strong enemy. Where did such a powerful enemy come from? The enemy stood opposite Encred and was going to kill the little rat who had entered the camp. The enemies prepared for battle, but at that time the tent next to them caught fire. One of the soldiers discovered more intruders. The Aspen camp was in turmoil and confusion. Everything went according to plan. Mac distracted most of the enemies, Encred attracted the attention of the others, and Andrew at that time set the tent on fire. Now all that's left is to get out of here. But first you need to deal with the enemy. Encred rushed to the attack. He saw the enemy's weak point and fired his piercing blow, aiming directly at the opponent's lowered head. But to the guy's surprise, the enemy soldier easily avoided the blow, and Encred fly past him. He ended up behind the guy. Moreover, the enemy managed to wound Encred in the side. Encred bent over, clutching the wound. His best shot was wasted. The soldier turned to his wounded enemy. Contempt for the pathetic little rat was written all over his face. Encred realized that with his current skills, he could not defeat the opponent who was approaching him to finish him off. Encred did not know what to do with his resentment. He had worked so hard to get to this point. He broke through the encirclement into the field. He lost all his comrades and died himself. He thought he was finally out of this day. So that's who became his real wall. If Encred rushes at him now, another brutal death awaits him. Then you will have to seize command again, break through the field and repeat this day endlessly. Encred clutched the sword in his hands. The enemy was dumbfounded. This almost corpse opposite him suddenly laughed. Encred raised his head and confidently said that he would defeat this thug. He was going to chop the bastard into pieces and give it to the dogs to eat. He will overcome this wall no matter what. Encred raised his sword and began to fight. The knight attacked first, and Encred parried his blow with such force that sparks flew from under the swords. The knight raised his sword and slashed downwards, but Encred jumped back and the enemy's sword stuck into the ground. But the enemy, even from such a disadvantageous position, immediately counterattacked the guy. Encred leaned back and was able to block the blow with his sword again. The enemy's precise and fast movements did not give Encred a chance to retaliate. The difference in skills was very large. Encred retreated and defended himself, but sensing a gap in the enemy's defense, he threw his blade there, which the knight batted away with the back of his gloved hand. And again he rushed to attack Encred, who had nowhere to retreat. At this time the fire spread throughout the camp. Aspen's soldiers shouted that the fire had already reached the flagpole. The knight was ready to finish off Encred, but the monk who ran up to them shouted that the priority now was not some half-dead enemy bastard. But judging by the knight's face, he was not going to let go of his victim, and Encred gripped the sword tightly with his hands. The knight looked sideways at the guy and said that they would see each other soon, and left the battlefield. Encred did not believe that he was retreating so easily. Maybe it wasn't a real wall? The knight, meanwhile, walked to the site of the fire and gave out commands. Encred realized that the day was not over, and he had not destroyed the wall. He was still in the center of the camp. Andrew ran towards him, shouting that they needed to leave now. Encred took one last look at the figure of his enemy. He turned around and their eyes met. Encred sheathed his sword in order to retreat. Their squad began to run as fast as they could. Along the way, they killed enemies who stood in their way. Mac realized that there would be no persecution, but cries were already heard from the enemy camp to catch the intruders and not leave them alive. Several Aspen soldiers blocked the squad's path. Mac stabbed his sword into the throat of one soldier, and Andrew killed the second one so quickly that he did not understand why he died. Encred shouted not to hesitate and to continue running. Henry shouted that if you go towards the habitat of steppe foxes and snakes, your pursuers will not be able to keep up with them. His comrades had a question. Will they be able to get there themselves? Henry knew the safe zone. the hunter's path. Uncreed trusted Henri and the guy led the squad to the path. They found themselves in the grass again. The steps of the pursuers were not heard. A fox stood on a stone and looked carefully at the people walking ahead. Thanks to the fact that Andrew and Mac fought well, the reconnaissance team easily passed through enemy ambushes. Without Henri's instructions, they would not have been able to break away from the enemy. The detachment reached here thanks to the efforts of all the soldiers. It's already dawn. The reconnaissance party ran to their camp across a field of grass. They returned on their last legs, dirty, wounded, and exhausted. Encred watched as his eternal today turned into tomorrow. He got over the wall again. A new morning has come. The Aspen camp was despondent. The flags were burned. The monk said they would have to prepare again, and he added venomously that he didn't think that Grey Dog's famous squad couldn't cope with a bunch of scum. The detachment commander was not happy about this remark. He didn't understand anything. Elite fighters were stationed in the tall grass. They were broken through and set on fire by a bunch of enemy people. Grey Dog is an independent company in the Aspen Army with special powers. The name of the detachment comes from the Grey Dogs of the Aspen Principality, the Grey Dogs. They are known for their tenacious nature and the fact that they will not rest until they achieve their goal. And it doesn't matter what their goal is, love or battle. Therefore, the group bearing the name Grey Dog is also known as the Stubborn Lovers. The squad leader asked Mitch Hewer if the enemy he fought that night was strong. Platoon leader Mitch replied that if it had not been for the fire, he would have dealt with it on the spot. The guy was lucky to get away. This is also a kind of skill. But such luck does not happen twice. Encred also thought about his opponent. He failed to overcome this wall and wanted to continue the fight. Mitch thought that someday he would kill the bastard with his own hands. The Stubborn Lovers identified their next goal. At the same time, Encred swore to himself to overcome this wall. Ram lay in the tent and threw his axe up in the air out of boredom. He was waiting for news from the commander who was about to return. Is the guy really dead? Lately he had improved his skills, although he remained a novice, so his death would not be something surprising. Encred was one of the few people Ram liked, but if this happened, then nothing could be done. Ragna woke up and sat up on the bed, stretching. Ram immediately showed him the middle finger on his hand, and Ragna in response deftly showed him the middle finger on his foot. Rem took the axe more comfortably and prepared to attack the scoundrel. Ragna responded by drawing his sword. Encred was reporting to the company commander. The elf asked incredulously, did he accidentally discover an ambush, penetrate the enemy center, and accidentally start a fire there? The guy replied that he simply made the best decisions at each moment, and was lucky. After a short silence, the elf sent the soldier to rest. She assumed that he would do something like this, but she did not expect such a result. What kind of person is this Encred? At the entrance to the tent, Encred was met by Andrew Gardner. He apologized for his rudeness and thanked them for the fact that they all survived. The guy would like to meet the commander again. Encred replied that they would meet if they fought together on the battlefield. 4 of the squad remained alive and they all bowed to Encred, but the guy was not happy. I kept thinking that I could save those who died, if only he were stronger. By repeating this day, he was able to look beyond his capabilities. Now is the time to do more than flounder, and strive for the image of the knight he wants to become. He will move forward based on today. And so as not to repeat the same day again, he will become stronger. He was already approaching his tent when he heard the screams of the soldiers that these 2 psychos were fighting again. The battle of the Titans was in full swing. Rem wielded an axe, and Ragna attacked him with a sword. Both were very pleased to relieve the boredom. Encred thought that he had never seen such faces on his subordinates. They never behaved like this with him in training. Before him were simply monsters, intoxicated with battle. But with Encred, they had no need to show their true selves. Encred decided to take things step by step. The first thing is to get them to show him such faces. He threw his sword between the fighters. The guys stopped the fight and said that the commander did not need to sneak up on them and peek. Ram said that if the commander is not going to train with him, then he can leave him alone. And Ragna asked where the commander was wounded. Encred tried to make comments about the fight, but neither Rem nor Ragna wanted to listen to him. They went about their business, not paying attention to Encred. Upon learning of the enemy ambush, the battalion commander redeployed all infantry forces to the tall grass nearby. During this time, Encred's wounds had almost healed. He had time to conduct analysis and train. Ram was sure that the commander would go too far with his training. He hasn't recovered yet. The next morning, Ragna woke up and found that Encred had gone to training again. He took the sword and walked outside the tent. He had a talent for fencing. It was not difficult for him to become stronger. He learned early how to become a knight. But he was bored. Even if he became a knight, there is nothing he would like to do. Is it worth putting in so much boring effort to become a knight? Not understanding the meaning, Ragnar lost his goal and stopped in his development. He began to watch Enkrid's training. He worked without sparing himself and swung his swords without interruption. The wounds were still making themselves felt, and the guy was exhausted. Ragnar noted that the platoon commander had studied incorrectly from the very beginning. When I first picked up a sword, I had to learn the basics, but he learned all sorts of tricks and ruined his skills. Now no matter how much you train, you won't get stronger. And yet why does the commander exhaust himself so much with training? Ragnar could not stand it and asked Enkrid this question. He stopped and replied that he wanted to become stronger. Why is he getting stronger? To become a knight. Ragnar countered that a knight is not someone who just fights well. What's the point? Enkrid replied that to do what he thought was right. To raise the sword for the sake of the poor and the sick, for the sake of honor, for the sake of those he loved. That was what it meant to be a knight in his mind. Ragnar thought for the first time that a knight was about conviction and honor, and force is only a means. He approached the commander and asked if he wanted to learn how to wield a sword correctly. Of course Enkrid wanted this more than anything else. Ragnar already regretted asking. Now he'll have to mess with the guy. But still, judging by Enkrid's persistent gaze, this could be interesting and will relieve boredom. Among the savages, of whom Rem is a prominent representative, the commander taught this stupid heart of the beast and the stabbing blow. This will do, but everything else will have to be forgotten. Enkrid gasped. Forget the Valen mercenary style? Ragnar was relentless. This definitely needs to be forgotten. If he doesn't forget, then even when he learns the correct technique, out of habit he will use the old techniques. We have to choose. Either forget everything and start from scratch, or be content with the current level. Enkrid decided to start from scratch. Ragnar's eyes widened. Seriously? He thought that the commander would not dare to take such a step. This guy is completely crazy. Why did Ragnar get involved in this? With the strength of a commander, light weapons will not suit him. A long sword would be more suitable for him. Ragnar suggested exchanging swords. Enkrid clarified whether Ragnar really wants to give him his sword. The guy replied that this was not a problem. He picked up his sword on the battlefield. The long sword is held with the right hand in front and the left behind. Enkrid grabbed the sword with all his strength so as not to drop it. Ragnar asked who taught him this. Enkrid replied that Ram. Ragnar considered Ram to be a useless monkey. He told the commander to take a stance, which Enkrid did. Ragnar attacked the commander with a swing of his sword. Enkrid blocked his blow with his sword. The strong shock caused the sword to vibrate and his hand became very sore. Ragnar said it was natural. If you strain and just push with force, you can break. The commander is now like a wooden stick. Enkrid was slightly offended by the wooden stick. Can you explain it normally without stupid comparisons? He understood that he had to be more flexible so as not to break. We need to act more smoothly. They had been training for quite some time. Ragnar made comments about keeping the center of gravity correctly, placing your feet correctly. And now the commander is tense again and could break his wrist. Finally, Enkrid collapsed on the grass, exhausted. Ragnar looked at the guy thoughtfully. He didn't even think that he had no talent at all, and even basic sword skills, a very sad case. It looks like fencing training alone won't do the trick. Enkrid squeezed the sword again and demanded to repeat everything again. Ragnar took a deep breath, assessing the scale of the problems and suggested starting with walking. Rem's mocking voice came from behind that the idiot had not been seen all day. Missed lunch playing toy soldiers? Is he mocking the commander? Ram is about to punch the freak in the face, or better yet rip his hands off. Enkrid asked what happened that Ram was wearing his best uniform. He replied that the command had announced a general gathering. The enemy is approaching from afar. The troops lined up in front of their commanders. The detachment under the command of Enkrid also stood in the general formation. Ragnar was worried that he had been teaching Enkrid how to fencing in vain. He has not gotten used to it, and will not be able to fight normally with the new sword. And because of this, he may die. In today's battle, Ragnar decided not to leave the commander. Enkrid looked at the rows of troops of the approaching enemy and wondered why they lined up so strangely. What's wrong with their system? Their tattered flags fluttered over Asper's troops. The hooded figure was making strange movements with his hands. The enemy troops began to disappear into the fog. The elf realized that the enemy was using magic. The fog was so thick that the person standing next to him could not be seen. Enkrid felt like the only person on the battlefield. Panic began among the soldiers. Suddenly Enkrid heard a sound that seemed familiar to him. The soldiers also heard this, and did not understand what was ahead. Enkrid shouted with all his might that it was arrows flying. Not all the soldiers had time to raise their shields, and the arrows flying out of the fog hit many. The elf deflected arrows and cursed the enemy's unexpected strategy with the last words. They were caught in a trap. She screamed at the soldiers to duck and raise their shields. The enemy shaman was happy that the spell worked. He spent a lot of effort on it. He obtained the blood of various animals, water from the clearest lake, and used a spell to call rain. When the spell is activated, thick fog obscures vision, but visibility is maintained under the flag, which serves as a conduit for the magic. You can attack the enemy unilaterally, and he came up with a name for this spell, Fog of Extermination. When the flag almost burned down, the shaman lost his mind. I barely managed to complete the spell. Mitch approached the shaman and said that if it weren't for the guy who almost destroyed their flag, everything would have been much simpler. A huge number of arrows flew at the soldiers. Encred tried to fight them off with his sword and dodge. From behind, Ragnar's voice was heard from the fog, shouting to the commander not to raise his head. Rem's deep voice scolded the bastards who used magic. Ram himself was not visible in the fog, although his voice was close to Eknarid. It was impossible to fight. The arrow stuck right at the guy's feet. His breathing was short and he was very tense. His legs were stiff. He was completely unable to use the skills that Ragnar had taught him today. The guy told him that until he fully mastered the techniques, it was better not to engage in battle at all. But not fighting on the battlefield is certain death. Encred came up with a brilliant idea. Death is what is needed now. He walked towards the vague enemy silhouettes. Ragnar, emerging from the fog, shouted for the commander to go back. But Encred did not listen to him. Amid Ragnar's cry that the commander had gone crazy, Encred went out to meet the enemy soldier. He put his spear forward, and he pierced Encred right through. The guy's last thought was that he would go take lessons from Ragnar again. The enemy rejoiced at the death of the damned enemy bastard. The lesson with Ragnar continued the next day. Ragnar was a fencing genius, so not the best teacher. Everything seemed obvious to him, so his explanations were extremely meager. It seems that the commander understands him, but his body does not listen. Here you just need to lower the sword. What's so difficult? Encred gloomily asked where the center of gravity should be moved. Ragnar had never asked such a question and was stumped. He made an instinctive movement, and everything turned out right. These geniuses themselves don't know how they do it all. Although Ragnar's explanations were not ideal, Encred knew how to listen and learn carefully, and he repeated the sword stance and foot movements over and over again. As the battle began, arrows flew out of the fog. Encred still had a hard time in battle. He again met the enemy's spear, which tore his throat. He will die and study again. On the 30th day, his movements became smoother. He dodged Ragnar's sword. The guy noted that the commander's steps were very good. Where did he learn this? Once the steps were mastered, Ragnar moved on to the basics of fencing. The main attacks with a sword are slashing, stabbing, and cutting. For protection, the blade is used, and if the sword is of good quality, then the flat side is used. The shortest distance between the fighter and the enemy is called the line of attack. Fencing is about blocking the enemy's line of attack and advancing your own. The commander must imagine the opponent in his mind, and then strike with the sword. On the battlefield in the fog, the same spearman carried out a strike, which Encred dodged. The spear whistled close to the neck. The legs became lighter. The movements became more confident, and it became easier for Encred to dodge. But 4 arrows flying straight at him did not leave the guy a single chance. So gradually changes began in the infinite today. Encred easily fought off Ragnar's attack in training. Ragnar's jaw dropped. What was that? How was the commander able to do this? A series of trainings and deaths led to the fact that Ragnar no longer knew what to teach the commander when he used a diagonal strike. He was definitely getting better, and could already fight Ragnar almost on equal terms. He could even force him to retreat and defend himself from furious attacks. On the 100th day during training, Ragnar asked who was standing in front of him. He had never seen this man fight like this. Encred happily noticed that Ragnar's look at him had changed. He developed a talent that seemed impossible to develop. Now confident, Encred stood in the thick fog. Ragnar shouted at him for the commander to stop, but Encred overcame another barrier and ran towards the enemy. He deviated from the spear's flight, and he ran forward as fast as he could. But the next spearman, emerging from the thick fog, plunged his spear into his stomach. Again, Ragnar invited him to learn how to wield a sword. For the sake of the path to knighthood, Encred was ready to learn and die again and again. After the first swings of the sword, Ragnar was at a loss. The commander can't be that good. Was he still fighting so poorly on purpose? His fundamentals are very good. He rather needs practice in real combat conditions. This practice was more than enough. For more than 200 days, Encred had seen arrows flying out of the fog. Now he will test how effective his new skills are. He successfully ducked under the spear, and he pierced the enemy with his sword. He remembered where and when enemies jumped out of the fog and chopped them down without pity. Even if he didn't see them, he could hit several. They themselves did not understand where death overtook them. The opponents heard an unclear noise in the fog, and they were immediately struck down by a fast figure armed with a sword. Panic began in the enemy camp. The invisible fighter destroyed his opponents, but he was unable to escape the crossbow arrow. Ragna taught Encred that the main thing in battle is the eyes, hands, and feet. Always watch and predict. Move your feet quickly to overcome obstacles. Apply finishing blows with your hands. Now things were going differently for Encred. It felt different before he perfected the basics. He easily broke through the ranks of enemies and left no one alive. He encountered a line of crossbowmen. One of them said that the guy cleverly made his way to them. But does he really think that he can cope with them alone and leave alive? Encred held his sword at the ready. He invited the commander of a company of crossbowmen to fight like men with swords. Encred wanted to test himself again. The enemy soldier thought he was facing a crazy bastard, and a swarm of arrows flew at Encred, which interrupted his life. He found himself in the dark again. A boatman he knew called him stupid. Who himself gets into trouble? Crazy idiot. Encred woke up in his bed at camp. Ram had already woken up and was arguing with those around him. Encred remembered that every time fog appeared on the battlefield, Rem shouted that it was witchcraft. The enemy's formation had no tactical value. It looked like they were guarding a flag. Encred asked Ram if he knew anything about witchcraft. Ram was surprised by this question early in the morning. Why does the commander need this? Encred asked Ram to tell everything. What he knows. Does the commander know the difference between magic and witchcraft? Encred suggested that magic was more common. Ram replied that it was not entirely true. Witchcraft requires an intermediary, and not just needed but really needed. Without a mediator, witchcraft is over. Encred thought about it. The fog is created by enemy spells, and the flag serves as an intermediary for this. If you destroy the flag, the fog will clear. Witchcraft came from the west, and Ram was from there. Maybe he knows how to use magic. Ram replied that he had seen a lot, but there were very few real sorcerers. Everyone who walks around the world is a charlatan. Encred went out for training, where Ragna told him that what the commander can do has a lot in common with his knowledge, and asked Encreda if he knew about the five-sword style. 500 years ago, a genius appeared, who had no equal. A child born into a peasant family at the age of 9 killed a gang of robbers who attacked his house with a poker. The boy lost his parents early and grew up early. Then he learned the principles of fencing. One aristocrat heard about the boy, found him and adopted him. So this genius received the name Dionysius Oniak. But in addition to talent, the boy was born with great bad luck. At the age of 12 he fell ill and became paralyzed. However, he did not give up, but made a revolution in fencing. He divided all fencing styles into categories: a straight and precise sword, a heavy and powerful sword, an open and sweeping sword, a fast and even faster sword, a soft and flowing sword. Thanks to this classification, the Oniak family became the most influential in the empire. This fencing school has been passed down from generation to generation. Currently, these are the northern heavy sword style, the central straight and flexible sword style, the western fast sword style, the southern flowing sword style, and the eastern fancy sword style. To use the northern style, Ragna developed a special technique. This is the point of concentration. You need to forget about everything around and focus only on your opponent and the sword. Ragna took a stance to show Encred the style in practice. Before Encred could even blink, the blade of the sword was near his neck, and it cut her quite badly. Blood flowed. It was faster than Ram's axe. Encred realized that if Ragna had made a slight mistake, he would have died before the battlefield. Ram was right there. He yelled that the idiot wanted to kill the commander. Ragna replied that he was just helping with the training, and a person's concentration increases in the face of death. They started quarreling again, and Encred thought that both his teachers were explaining things poorly. But there was no time to fight. The order came for a general gathering. Ragna remarked to Encred that he must have felt his senses heightened at the moment of mortal danger. When the point of concentration is achieved, the sword works as if by itself. The heart of the beast is courage in the face of death, and the point of concentration, on the contrary, requires tension. Encred needed to train in real conditions to capture this feeling. The flag, which serves the enemy as an intermediary for witchcraft, must be destroyed to stop the enemy's one-sided attack. The fog thickened on the battlefield for the umpteenth time. Encred added a new goal to himself, to get to the flag and tear it down. He began to break through the enemy line. Of course, it was easier to do this with Ram or Ragna, but Encred decided to try it himself for now. The first thing he did was kill the soldier with the spear. Full concentration is not an easy task in the face of danger. Encred died again and again without having time to react. Ragna taught him that when a point of concentration is achieved, the tip of the sword seems to slow down. Encred did not understand anything. Maybe the courage he received from the heart of the beast is getting in the way. Ragna didn't believe it. It's so simple. The area around is blurred, only the enemy's sword is visible, and it's easy to predict the trajectory of the strike. Doesn't the commander feel this? Encred asked how Ragna learned this. The guy replied that it just happened somehow. I concentrated on one point and it worked. Encrid decided to continue learning concentration, and for now will focus on destroying enemy flags. You need to get through the enemy ranks while minimizing the losses of your allies. A few seconds before the arrows arrived from the fog, Encrid screamed at the top of his lungs for everyone to lie down. The soldiers carried out the order with bewilderment. The next order was to put up shields. The flying arrows did not damage the soldiers behind the shields, and Encrid was already rushing towards the enemy. He repeated this day 300 times. He could predict attacks with his eyes closed. He attacked enemies from behind and killed them on the spot. His attacks were sudden and violent. He spared no one. The Aspen soldiers couldn't believe that this bastard was doing so much damage to them single-handedly. They rushed at Encrid with the whole crowd in order to finally deal with him. But he swung his sword so much, and every blow reached its target that few people dared to approach him. The enemy commander guarding the flag yelled at his soldiers not to be stupid, but to catch the bastard. Encrid, like a ghost, jumped out in front of him from the thick fog and destroyed the commander. It began to seem to the soldiers that it was not a man who was fighting them, but a demon. It took Encrid 10 repetitions of the day to get to that flag. Finally, he cut the pole and the flag began to fall. He definitely destroyed the flag, but the fog did not clear. Dozens of spears and erasers pierced his body. The enemy laughed at him. The guy seems to know something about magic, but he fell into a trap. Encrid realized that there was only one real flag. The other 5 were fakes. Among them, you need to find the real one. The chance of one finding the right flag is 1 in 5. The next day, not all the soldiers obeyed Encrid and did not fall to the ground and put up their shields. There were many more victims. Encrid had been running along the familiar path for a long time, repelling all attacks. It took him 3 days to destroy the second flag, but the flag turned out to be a fake. The guy carefully memorized the location of the flags that he had already destroyed. The third flag required 5 repetitions, and again it was a deception. The fourth flag took 7 reps of the day, but Encrid also failed. 2 flags left. Which one is real? Encrid was waiting for the fight and thinking hard. Probably the farthest. He is protected more tightly. Fog, panic, Encrid screamed, "Lie down. Put up your shields." This time the tactic worked. Not a single soldier was wounded or killed. Ram shouts, "These are sorcerers," and Encrid gives the order for Ram to follow him. Ram understands that the commander is crazy, but follows the order. The 2 of them come across a soldier with a spear, and Ram blows his head off with an axe. Now Encrid's plan is for Rem to distract the enemies, while Encrid makes his way deeper. Rem grabs the half-dead enemy and demands to know who cast this spell. The soldier is silent, and Ram grabs the next one to find out the necessary information. Encrid does not deviate from his path. He has been dying in this fog for over a year now, but now it will come to an end. The guy is already close to the main flag. He swings his sword to cut down the shaft, but another sword blocks his way. Mitch blocks his sword and attacks. Encrid didn't expect to meet anyone but this bastard now. He completely forgot about it. Mitch is happy, and thanks God for fulfilling his request, to kill the baby rat with his own hands. Encrid looked carefully at the enemy and asked who he was. Mitch was stunned. He had never been humiliated like that before. This scoundrel forgot him a few days after their fight? A silent question was reflected in Encrid's eyes. Who has he managed to forget? He looked intently at his opponent and repeated the question. Who is this guy? Mitch roared that as soon as he pierced the impudent man with his sword, he would immediately remember everything, and he rushed to the attack. Encrid was able to easily dodge the enemy's sword thrust. Now he began to attack. Mitch retreated under the onslaught of Encrid. He was already starting to doubt whether this was the same guy he fought with a few days ago. His skills have increased dramatically, which is impossible in such a short time. Although Mitch had no doubt that he would defeat his opponent, his skills were much better. But Mitch still had a hard time in this fight. He had to retreat and block the blows. Encrid analyzed his opponent's style and realized that he was using a basic sword style, and mixes it with the technique of deflecting attacks. Mitch put all his strength into the blow, and Encrid had to tense up so as not to get injured. The guy focused his attention on what was in front of him. He felt for a balance that could collapse if he were only distracted for a moment, and he put everything he had into the blow. Mitch blocked that blow again. Encrid forgot about flags, about victory and defeat, and about fencing. Everything around disappeared. Only the sword remained. But Mitch's blade broke through Encrid's defenses and pierced his chest. Then Encrid remembered his opponent and exhaled with relief. It was he who stood in front of the flagpole and in the meadow. Mitch Hewer, lieutenant of the Grey Dog Detachment of the Principality of Aspen. He needs to know the name of his rival, the platoon commander of the Kingdom of Narilla, Encrid. Aspen's soldiers were already running to the battlefield. How was this soldier able to get to their shrine without being noticed? But Mitch looked disappointed. Why is that bastard he killed smiling? Encrid smiled because he realized that he did not need the concentration born of the fear of death. Ragnar was wrong. He needed a worthy opponent, someone who would force him to fight tooth and nail to become a better person. Mitch, in turn, thought that he had stabbed some psycho with a sword. At the next training session, Ragnar saw that the commander was scattered and was not listening to him at all. Did he really give up so quickly? But when Ram announced that everyone needed to get together and line up, Enkrid was determined to go into battle. Ragnar, inspired by the commander's enthusiasm, decided to show his best side in this battle. Again, the soldiers, obeying Enkrid's orders, covered themselves with shields from arrows. Ram ran after Enkrid into the enemy formation. This time Ragnar followed them on his own initiative. Both guys got into a fight with Aspen's soldiers. Rem killed them with an axe, and Ragnar with a sword. Enkrid broke through in the same way as before, and again came face to face with Mitch Hewer. This time he greeted the enemy, and was the first to offer to fight. Mitch was taken aback by such an unexpected proposal. Was this guy specifically looking for a meeting with him? Enkrid replied that he fell in love with his enemy in the meadow, and was looking for him. This was the first time that a member of the stubborn lovers' squad had been found before themselves. Enkrid rushed into battle, and he plunged again into a state of concentration where only the sword was felt. And this time Mitch beat him and pierced him with a blade. Standing over the enemy's body, Mitch didn't understand what this idiot was counting on. Enkrid analyzed what he had done wrong. You can't concentrate intentionally. You need to naturally immerse yourself in the sword. So repeating again and again, Enkrid found Mitch and entered into a fight with him. This happened the 18th time too, and on the 28th. Enkrid was constantly in a state of concentration. After the 48th time, Enkrid again stood in front of Ragnar in training. He saw the gleaming tip of Ragnar's sword close to him. Ragnar was reflected in his pupils, and Enkrid made a subtle movement with his sword and repulsed the enemy's weapon. Ragnar opened his eyes wide in surprise. The commander had just repelled a blow in a state of absolute concentration. How did he do it? He has complete control of his sword and body, both strength and technique. Everything has grown unrecognizably compared to what it was before this sword strike. Enkrid turned to leave. Now he needed to get an appointment with the company commander. It's time to get over today. The elf sat at the table and read the reports. Enkrid said that he wanted to talk to her about magic. He just remembered what he saw during the reconnaissance. The Aspen soldiers called the suspicious man Mr. Magician. The elf pricked up her ears and demanded details. Enkrid told her everything he could to win this battle. Again, in the thick fog, arrows flew at the soldiers, but they were all protected by shields. The commanders of all units were warned about this danger. Enkrid again rushed towards the enemy. Ram and Ragnar fought on the front line. Enkrid's task was the flagpole and Mitch who guarded it. Enkrid had to surpass and defeat this guy. Mitch Hewer was surprised when Enkrid called him by name. How does he know it? Enkrid told the enemy that he wanted to settle scores with him from the first meeting, and he rushed to the attack. Mitch jumped back from the slash, and Enkrid's sword hit the ground. Mitch did not remain standing, but attacked furiously. Enkrid blocked his blow, falling to one knee. Mitch filled his sword and was about to slash from above, but Enkrid's sword kept him from doing this. The rivals then broke the distance between themselves. Then they cut it, and their swords clashed so fiercely that sparks flew. Mitch indignantly asked why the guy hid his abilities so carefully. Enkrid apologized for the inconvenience caused. It happened that way. Mitch asked the enemy to tell him his name, and the guy replied that his name was Enkrid. After a fierce attack from both sides, when the fighters felt that they were equal in strength, Mitch said he would remember the name. Enkrid replied that there is no need to try. If he forgets, he will remind him. Mitch loomed over him with his sword. Enkrid concentrated completely, shifted the center of gravity to the right leg, and prepared for a diagonal strike. The technique and experience gained through repetition clearly loomed before his eyes. He swung his sword at the same time as his opponent, and his sword cut the enemy's neck. Blade Mitch inflicted the same cut on Enkrid's neck. Mitch was beside himself. He fights on equal terms with some upstart and cannot kill him. Moreover, he himself is wounded. He decided to strike the decisive blow because he saw that Enkrid was already tired, with the sword from bottom to top, describing a large circle, and now the deadly blow of the wheel is ready to hit the bastard. But Enkrid saw everything this time. It is difficult to predict the moment of the attack and its trajectory. Mitch demonstrated a technique that Enkrid had suffered dozens of times. The guy waved his sword and called his opponent to him. He read the trajectory and deflected the sword. The blow was so strong that Mitch stepped back. This was beyond Mitch's understanding. The Hoyer family is one of the three main families ruling the Principality of Aspen. It symbolizes military power. They collected and educated talented people, without distinguishing between direct and lateral branches. Mitch Hewer was from the side branch, and had proven himself to be an outstanding talent. At 15 years old, he easily dealt with 2 adult soldiers. By the age of 22, he had become a strongman whose name thundered throughout the city. Thanks to his talent, he became one of the 3 best fighters in Grey Dog. Few could match him in swordsmanship. He was pleased and proud of his abilities. He was very arrogant and believed that everyday training was not for him. Now in the battle, Encred bypassed Mitch's defense and pierced him with a sword. Mitch still muttered, spitting out blood, that the bastard was no match for him in either strength or technique. Encred easily agreed with him. But there is one caveat. He won today's battle. While they were having polite conversations, Aspen's soldiers noticed that Mitch Huron was wounded and ran to save their commander. One soldier was covering Mitch's wound and trying to revive him. The knights ordered Mitch to be taken to safety. And Encred had another serious opponent, who didn't think that this guy alone would be able to beat them up like that. Of course, the enemy immediately rushed to attack Encred. Not only did Encred have to fight, but he was also surrounded by crossbowmen ready to shoot him. Now his task was to break the flag, and make your way to retreat through a wall of enemies. The knight did not bother himself with combat, he simply commanded fire, and arrows fired from all the crossbows flew at Encred. It was impossible to evade all attacks, and Encred decided to take a risk and break through. Seeing that the impudent stranger was fighting off the crossbow arrows, the enemy knight drew his sword and attacked. Encred easily blocked his blow with his sword. His sword cracked. The enemy used the heavy sword style. To break through directly, Encred would have to die several more times. But his current goal was to destroy the damned flag. He decided to throw the sword straight at the waving banner. Even minor damage will render the magical conduit useless. The knight attacked with unrelenting fury. Encred fought back and thought about where it would be better to hit. You need to aim at the junction of the flag and the staff. The blade flew towards the target. The knife cut down the flag, and it began to fall to the ground. People fought on the battlefield in the fog. The elf reported to her superiors about the possible presence of magic and requested countermeasures, but no action was taken. This kingdom is rotten. They simply sent the young man to the front line as a battalion commander. In this situation, the complete destruction of the army is only a matter of time. Suddenly there was a ray of hope. The fog cleared and the enemy soldiers succumbed to panic. What happened to their banner? The elf attacked the enemy and killed one of them. Now that the fog is cleared, there is one chance left to turn the tide. She gave the order for everyone to attack. The soldiers rushed forward with the firm intention of destroying all opponents. Without the fog, the situation improved. Who destroyed magic? Is that platoon commander really Encred? Who was not in the best situation, wounded and with a broken sword. He miscalculated. He hoped that after the destruction of the flag, while retreating to his positions, he would meet Rem or Ragna, but he only met Aspen's soldiers. Unfortunately, Ram was fighting far away in the meadow. He captured one soldier, and he demanded that the magician be brought to him. Ragna got lost and came to his position with his sword at the ready. This greatly surprised his colleagues in arms. Opponents mocked Encred. Is he going to survive in this condition? One of the soldiers raised his sword over him. Encred decided it was all over. At that moment, a panther attacked the soldier and the enemy fell to the ground. It was the same panther that Encred had seen in the thickets of grass. The panther charged at Aspen's soldiers. They opened indiscriminate fire from crossbows, but the panther broke the string on their weapon. The animal stood near Encred's feet and bared its teeth. The Knight of Aspen approached Encred with a sword. The panther couldn't stop him. At this time, a hand lay on Encred's shoulder, and someone's voice told him to step back, and then they would sort it out without him. Encred recognized the platoon commander Benzins, who was going to take the fight. Benzins brought with him a company of crossbowmen. He attacked the knight and they exchanged blows. But the knight was so strong that Benzins flew to the feet of Encred, and he gave the order to the crossbowmen to shoot at the enemy. The knight easily repulsed all the arrows. The soldiers decided that this was a monster, not a man. At the same moment, a panther jumped on top of the knight, baring its teeth and releasing its claws. The knight struck the beast with his sword and threw the animal back. Encred narrowed his eyes and focused on the enemy soldier's sword. This big sword cannot be stopped by force. He grabbed Benzin's sword, and he blocked the stunning blow with his face. With the flat side of the sword he held the enemy, who was pressing on him with his entire mass. Encred decided to duck, just like Mitch Hewer did. He carried out the technique brilliantly, and found himself out of reach of the enemy's sword. The knight recognized Mitch Hewer's style. How does this idiot know him? Encred was very glad that everything worked out so well for him. Benzins came to Encred's aid. He attacked the enemy, but he dodged the blow with his sword. The knight saw that soldiers of the enemy army were rushing towards them, who had broken through the defenses of Aspen. He cursed dirtily, forgetting that this was unworthy of a knight. He had no choice but to retreat. In parting, he promised to remember Encred. Encred didn't mind. Let him remember for good health. Aspen's army was ordered to retreat. Benzin shouted to Encred that they also needed to leave. The guy needs to bandage his wounds, but Yunzins has no bandages. Encred leaned over the panther. He decided to take her with him. Benzen's cursing carried Enkrid, who was dragging a panther in his hands. Enkrid lost consciousness. His wounds were bleeding heavily. He found himself in the dark again, and the boatman irritably told him that he was a stubborn fellow. What makes him be like this? Enkrid heard loud voices. The commander needs peace. If only he would open his eyes. The guy didn't understand what the commotion was outside. And what is so soft under his hand? He opened his eyes and found himself in bed, all bandaged. A panther slept next to him. His entire squad sat in the room and joyfully discussed that the commander had finally woken up. Otherwise they thought that he would definitely die. Enkrid sat down and asked what was happening and why his throat was so dry. Jackson handed him a glass of water and explained that the guy was thirsty due to heavy blood loss. The commander passed out on the way back and now he needs to rest. The guys were glad that Enkrid was fine and went about his business. Enkrid sighed. He managed to survive this day. Only Rem remained in the tent, looking intently at the commander. Enkrid decided that Ram was interested in the panther, but he replied that he was not interested in animals. He would like to know how Enkrid managed to recognize witchcraft. Enkrid thought about it. Tell him that he is going through the same day? Who will believe him? But I didn't want to lie either. Ram was always sincere with him and helped him so much. He replied that he knew Rem's fellow countryman. He told him about witchcraft, and Enkrid suggested that this could be it. It wasn't a lie. After all, Rem himself told Enkrid about witchcraft on one of the repeating days. Ram did not believe this version, but did not instruct. He advised the commander not to get involved in witchcraft, and he got ready to leave. Enkrid then asked, "Where did Rem go after the battle?" He replied that he went to look at the face of the one who planted the flag. But he didn't like the shaman's face and finished him off. At this time, Kreis returned to the tent and began to pester the panther, which did not like it very much. Her eyes glowed with blue fire and the animal was very serious. Enkrid warned Kreis to be careful. The panther might tear him apart. Kreis replied that his heart would sooner break if he refused 10,000 crowns. He heard from a guy who was with the commander on reconnaissance that this black panther was nicknamed Lake because of his blue eyes, reminiscent of lakes. A spiritual beast that feeds on some kind of earth energy. One of her claws costs 10,000, and she sheds them from time to time. Kreis wants to pick the moment and take the claw. 10,000 crowns is a gold coin, more than Kreis's salary. Enkrid had difficulty comprehending Kreis's words. He was thinking about something else. He was told that after the destruction of the fog, the advantage was on their side, but the army had to return without an obvious victory. After this, several days passed without the withdrawal of troops or other attacks. He remembered the fight and wondered if he would be able to repeat that sword slide again. The guy wasn't sure about it. That's why I started training while still wearing bandages. Jenkos was concerned that the commander's wounds might rupture, but Enkrid was confident that everything was under control, and it wouldn't hurt to warm up. Ragna also believed that now Enkrid could not do anything except stretch, and in general it was better for him to sleep more. Rem, on the contrary, bullied Ragna and advised him not to instill laziness in the commander. Ragna reached for his sword. A fight was brewing and Enkrid chimed in with a question about fencing. He easily used in battle a technique that he had never trained in his life. How is this even possible? Ram replied that this happens. The heart of the beast helps you look at the enemy's root. Eknerd could see in detail how he wielded the sword and how he distributed the force. Ragna confirmed that once the basics are in place, the steps become easier to understand. In addition, Enkrid mastered concentration. His gaze became sharper. But at the same time, the commander was also lucky. With his skills, you would have to repeat the techniques a couple hundred times to master them. Enkrid was dumbfounded by such an assessment of his talents. The past day had not been easy for him. Hundreds of days spent in the name of victory. He didn't just learn repeated events. He became stronger and developed his own skills. And he did all this despite his meager talents. He firmly told Ram and Ragna that he wanted a duel. The guys stared at the commander. Ram was often called a psycho, but here Enkrid surpassed him. Ranga surprisingly agreed with the savage Ram. What fight is it now? With such wounds, this is impossible. At this time, an elf entered the tent. She immediately asked Enkrid whether the broken conductor of witchcraft was his work. Enkrid admitted that it was him. He saw him during reconnaissance. The elf reminded him that there were 5 decoys. How did he know where the real flag was? The guy replied that he marked the real one. The elf was speechless. Then she turned around and walked towards the exit. Enkrid asked, was that all she wanted to know? The woman replied that she still wanted to look at the soldier. It strongly seems to her that they are connected by fate. Enkrid's jaw dropped at this statement. How to understand this? Ragna and Rem laughed. And the commander is not a mistake. What is his secret? Kreis overheard this conversation and was glad that now he would have someone with whom to open a salon for noble ladies. The terms of the contract will not disappoint Enkrid. Enkril sent all three away. He himself was wondering what the company commander meant. Kreis had other news. An esquire from the Knightly Order of the Red Cloaks has arrived. The division where Enkrid served was called the Cypress Division, in honor of one knight. And this very cypress belongs to the Knightly Order of the Red Cloaks. The kings are talented craftsmen, who are rare even for the continent. Therefore, they are not the only ones in the order. Esquire is a subordinate and student in one person, following the knight. Receive the recognition of a knight, the esquire becomes a junior knight. And on the last step of the ghostly peak, there is a knight who has surpassed the human limit. Usually esquires do not participate in battle without knights, so the new guest is going to become a junior knight after the battle. Soon there was a command to go into battle. Eknerd's team was about to leave, and their commander still had to recover. But Enkrid had a different opinion on this matter. He wanted to see everything for himself. Ram asked who could stop their commander from leaving the medical tent. Ideals achievable only in dreams. Troops built to perform on the battlefield. Opposite are enemy troops. Now they are right before Enkrid's eyes. He saw a soldier walking across the field towards the enemy. The knight walked with a confident gait, and his red cloak fluttered behind his back. The enemy archers drew their bowstrings. The knight didn't even slow down. The order was given to start shooting, and hundreds of arrows fell on the warrior in the red cloak. With a lightning-quick movement, he dodged the arrows. Ragna immediately realized that the knight was using will in his legs. At this time, the warrior ran with inhuman speed towards the enemy, and arrows pierced the ground where he had just stood. Having reached the enemy line, the knight drew his sword, and few people survived from the blows of his sword. Enkrid looked fascinated at what was happening on the battlefield. The knight swung his swords, and none of the enemies could even get close to him, and he inflicted great damage on them. Panic was brewing on the enemy side. How to fight him? The commanders hysterically demanded that the soldiers stop the knight, and at the same moment, the head of the leader of the enemies flew to the side. With one incredible leap, rising into the air, the knight took the life of an experienced soldier. The army recoiled in horror from such a fighter. It seemed impossible, but he did it. Enkrid opened his eyes wide, and Rem appreciated that this nobleman was good in battle. No wonder he was called a military expert. Ragna hoped that he would soon reach the level of esquire, and Jackson believed that the enemy commander-in-chief was an idiot, because he saw at least 5 opportunities to kill the esquire. The rest of the commanders prayed and were glad that everything was over and they didn't even have to retreat. Onkred analyzed the esquire's fencing. It doesn't look like a striking sword. The knight's fighting style combined the characteristics of a heavy and dancing sword. Slashing sword, straight and sharp style. He pulls the enemy into the attack radius and delivers a decisive blow. Heavy sword is a powerful style. He demolishes everything in his path with slashing attacks. Illusory sword, mind-fogging style, suddenly attacks enveloping the opponent's finger. The mercenary Valen's sword is based on it. Dancing sword is a fast style that attacks with lightning speed. Flowing sword, soft style eludes the enemy's attack, striking back. And although the heavy sword and the dancer were completely different from each other, Enkrid sensed both styles in the esquire at the same time. He realized that although the principle of each fencing style is different from each other, they all have the same origins. If you know all the elements of the 5 sword styles and perceive the sword as a living being, then you can combine styles. At this moment, the order was given to break through the enemy line. The soldiers rushed into battle. Enkrid's squad surrounded their commander so that he would not receive additional wounds. Enkrid at this time was thinking about how far the path he would have to go. He imagined that he was standing in front of an insurmountable mountain, but he will definitely check what is there at the top. At this time, the soldiers, inspired by their successes, went on the attack against the enemy. The war was drawing to a close. The coming winter and spring promised to be busy. The country was founded by 3 families. Duchy of Aspen, ruled by Duke Aspen. Now he was irritated. These sons of bitches broke the unspoken rule not to involve the forces of the knightly order in the battle. Eakins, who was involved in government and politics, reported that the enemy used the appearance of General Frog in the camp as a pretext. Only a member of the knightly order is able to resist him. The Duke was unhappy that Frog interfered in the battle, but he always acted as he pleased. Eakins believed that nothing would have happened if the witchcraft had worked successfully. The Duke said that the Grey Dogs must be held accountable for what happened. Harrier, the head of the armed forces, assured the Duke of Aspen that he would not leave it like that. At the same time, after Aspen's retreat, Enkrid's detachment set out as part of the rest of Nerilia's army. They were going to the fortified city of the Royal Colony, the border fortress of Borderguard. It was a military town on the border with Aspen, where 1/5 of the inhabitants were army. A rally was held in the square. Vladi appreciated the contribution of the heroes of Naurlia, who achieved victory in the last battle. Now everyone who showed courage will receive a reward. The commander of the 4th Detachment, Enkrid, is rewarded for destroying the vile sorcerers of Aspen. Amid the surprised noise of the troops, Enkrid went out to collect his reward. The army did not consider him a strong fighter. How could he break the witchcraft? Enkrid heard voices declaring that he was a weakling, and most likely took credit for the merits of his subordinates. Benzins shut the mouths of those talking nasty things. Andrew Gardner also took his side. Enkrid deservedly receives the award. He is an outstanding person. Enkrid's squad eagerly asked what the commander would spend the money on. Kreis could suggest a good place with drinks and women. Enkrid asked to be taken to the best blacksmith in the city. Kreis turned away, but was loudly indignant. Spend everything on a sword. They break on the battlefield. Why does a commander need such an expensive sword? But Enkrid knew that to become a knight, he needed to acquire weapons and prove your abilities. He will take an exam to increase his rank. Kreis even stopped lamenting about wasted money. He thought that the commander was not interested in promotion. Enkrid assured him that he did not intend to sit in the lower classes all his life. Kreis smiled. Then you need to pave the way first. Naurilia uses the ranking system to boost morale among soldiers. There are low ranks, semi-medium, medium, and high. Strong soldiers who go beyond the ranks are classified as a special rank. And the essence of the whole system is that the attitude towards a soldier changes in accordance with his rank. To gain weight, you need to fight and defeat 3 soldiers of the corresponding rank. For the assembled soldiers, the duels become a spectacle to bet on. Kreis immediately began collecting bets. The higher-ranking soldiers laughed at Enkrid. Low scum challenging the middle rank? Doesn't he know his place? A former famous mercenary, one of the strongest mid-ranking soldiers, became Enkrid's first rival. Only one person dared to bet on Enkrid. Everyone else was betting on his opponent. The soldiers entered the field and drew their swords. Enkrid became stronger over all the repeated days. This fight was not a threat to his life, and he had a chance to win it. The past Enkrid would not even dare to challenge most soldiers. But now he decided not to let his guard down and fight, as if death itself was before him. His opponent swung his sword and rushed to attack. Enkrid used the blow he had mastered during the previous battle. If it works, it will find the opponent's blind spot. From Enkrid's blow, the soldier suddenly staggered and dropped his sword. This came as a surprise to Enkrid. His opponent screamed that he couldn't feel his fingers. Enkrid turned the sword over and slammed the hilt into his opponent's face. The fight was over. Enkrid's opponent lay on the ground, deeply knocked out. The guy looked at him and thought, why was his opponent so weak? The audience howled with disappointment. The scum won so easily. Kreis knew everything and placed his only bet on this idiot. Did they deceive everyone? Kreis justified himself that the commander always fought hard, and he made a bet to support him. Enkrid also could not understand why victory came to him so easily. Maybe the enemy didn't take him seriously? One of the soldiers turned to the guy with the words that he won by accident, and now fluffed his feathers. Enkrid's new opponent was a soldier from a heavy infantry unit. He was armed with a spear. Enkrid noted that the opponent spins the tip of the spear to distract attention and attack unexpectedly, and so it happened. The lightning attack followed a few seconds later. Enkrid easily dodged the blow. He was at a loss. This is a simple lunge. Maybe this is a trick and then the enemy will strike with the shaft of the spear. Although judging by the opponent's face, this is the entire attack. Is it possible to hit him back? Enkrid did not hit his opponent very hard, and he fell to the ground. The guy won again. There was a buzz of voices among the spectators. Winning twice is no longer an accident. The lower rank easily took down 2 mid-rank soldiers. Kreis began to call the next enemy onto the battlefield. Spectators came, but said that it would be a shame to go out and lose. Benzin shouted that these people did not care about Enkrid, and now they have their tails between their legs. His neighbor recalled that Benzins himself despised the guy more than anyone else. Benzins replied that this was not the case. Ram laughingly invited one of the soldiers to go and fight his commander. He shouted more than anyone else that Enkrid was worthless. The soldier refused. Enkrid thought that until now he had to fight with all his strength. He remembered the sick-headed idiot Enkrid had met on the first endless day. After him there was no less a moron assassin. And most recently there was a battle with Mitch Harrier. There are also daily sparring sessions with subordinates. He had to participate in 2 difficult battles. And who knew that the day would come when he would consider the enemy a weakling? The next soldier entered the field. He really didn't like Enkrid's confident expression. The guy felt happy that he could now suppress his opponents. The fight began and Enkrid's opponent attacked the guy. Enkrid launched a counterattack, and the soldier barely held it back with his sword. Her face was distorted with tension. Enkrid jumped back and instantly attacked again. He struck. The opponent's sword could not stand it and fell into pieces. Encrid raised his sword over his unarmed and defeated enemy. Norelia is called the country of knights and honors the strongest. Here and now Encrid was able to declare himself. The audience fell silent. They looked at the battlefield in shock, on which lay one of the strongest soldiers in the army. So Encrid really is the destroyer of witchcraft. He himself broke the enemy flag and did not take away the merits of his subordinates. Someone in the stands shouted, "Destroy witchcraft." He was picked up by Andrew and all the other soldiers. A minute later, all the spectators were chanting Encrid's new title, Destroyer of Witchcraft. Chryse was unusually happy and congratulated the commander on his middle rank. But Encrid replied that it was too early to rejoice. There was still a high rank ahead. Chryse decided that he had heard wrong. Is the commander going to continue? A tall man stood up among the spectators and said that everything that was happening was funny. Eagle epaulets sparkled on his shoulder. These are shoulder straps of a border guard detachment directly subordinate to the kingdom. This is a small detachment consisting of soldiers of high and special ranks. What is he doing here? The man entered the field, and he invited Commander Encrid to fight him. Ram stood up from his seat worriedly. He immediately realized that the commander would have a hard time with this fighter. Encrid knew that the border guard detachment was comparable to the Grey Dogs of Aspan. The guy who challenged him can compete with Mitch Harrier. I wonder if he fights a fighter of this level again. What will happen? Encrid took a fighting stance and invited his opponent to attack. His opponent mentally admired that this guy did not chicken out in front of him. A border guard soldier. The spectators shouted at Encrid not to disgrace the title of Breaker of Witchcraft. The enemy drew his sword. The spectators shouted to Encrid that he, the infantryman, should beat the insolent border guard. The border guard looked gloomily at the stands. Don't these scum know that his squad is also infantry? It's worth knocking down their arrogance a little. And he rushed to attack Encrid. Very quickly his sword stabbed Encrid, but the guy quickly blocked it with his sword. The enemy did not expect this. He saw that his opponent had amazing concentration and balanced movements, kept to a minimum. He dodged Encrid's strike, and in turn, he responded with a sharp blow of his fist to the guy's body. Encrid grabbed his opponent's hand. He threw him to the ground and raised his sword over him. The soldier realized that he could die now, but Encrid's sword stuck into the ground next to him. The enemy was able to dodge the blow with a desperate jerk. Now the border guard attacked Encrid again, but he intercepted with his hand the tip of the sword, which was flying into his face, and he managed to break the distance between them. However, Encrid remained unarmed. Without giving his opponent a second to recover, the border guard attacked again. Encrid pulled out a knife and began to repel the attack. Suddenly an elf appeared on the battlefield. She fearlessly intervened in a fight between two men and stopped it. If the fight had lasted a little longer, it would have led to the killing of an ally. Encrid did not like the company commander's decision, and he was even more surprised by what he saw in front of him. Behind his opponent stood Jackson, who held a knife to the border guard's neck. In addition to Jackson, the entire Encrid team pulled up to the border guard. Ram gloomily informed the soldier that he was very lucky today. He snapped that it was just sparring, and if Rem became impudent, he would have new holes in his body. Encrid thought he missed a step in the middle of the fight, and it almost cost him his life. However, the audience admired how coolly the one they considered worthless fought. Encrid's opponent extended his hand to him and introduced himself, the junior commander of the border guard detachment Torres. They shook hands. The spectators whispered enthusiastically that this time Encrid's opponent was a soldier of a special rank, so Encrid deserves to rise to a high rank. So Encrid moved one step further. A few days later, the commander of the 1st Company and a detachment of heavy infantry, Turtle Graham, invited Encrid to transfer to his company. This was already the 3rd proposal from different military units. Graham persuaded the guy. His Turtle heavy infantry detachment was the core of the division. Encrid could join the army elite, but he refused. Graham offered to settle everything with the company commander, but that was not the point. Graham was very upset, but Encrid did not regret his choice at all. He returned to his squad, where Chryse could not understand why the commander kept refusing such good offers. Encrid wanted to say something, but he was interrupted by the new guest. Torres stood on the prog, who got straight to the point and invited Encrid to join the border guard detachment. This offer was more prestigious than the Turtle Squad. Encrid's squad decided that only a complete fool could refuse such an offer. Thors told Encrid that after the first blows, he realized that the guy was hungry for battle. If he went to them, he would have long hours of training and hellish battles. To join their ranks means reaching the limit of your strength. Encrid replied that there is no more suitable place for hellish battles and training than his squad. Moreover, he does not want to reach his limit. He wants to step over it. Winter has come with severe frosts. Ram wrapped himself in a blanket and cursed the damn cold. One tore off the blanket from him and suggested that he drive away the cold during training. Ram did not like this proposal very much. One turned to the commander with a request to train together to warm up, but Encred had to go on duty. He went out, and behind him came the cries of Rem for the commander to bring him a heated stone to bed. Despite the cold, people in the city were busy walking the streets. Merchants were offering their goods. On the way, Encred joined 2 border guards. Their main task was to fight, but in peacetime they patrolled the city to maintain order. Jackson and Vel were on patrol together. They greeted Encred. Encred had heard these names somewhere. Aren't these guys from the reconnaissance unit? The boys were glad to be patrolling with the Spellbreaker. Vela was very impressed that Encred was promoted from a low rank to a senior. Jackson suggested that his new acquaintance arrange a sparring session after the end of duty. It's interesting to see his skills. Encred did not mind, and they agreed to meet. It was very cold outside, and both guys huddled close to Encred. He didn't like being so close. He wasn't big enough to block the wind. They were the second to walk down a street full of people when they saw a man approaching them. He suddenly stumbled and began to fall on Encred. The guy wanted to support him, but a knife flashed in the man's hand. Encred did not have time to react, and the knife plunged into his chest. Encred didn't even understand what happened. Blood sprayed from the mouth. Jackson shut Encred's mouth, and Vel hugged him, and both said loudly that the guy had been drinking this morning. Nobody noticed anything. Encred realized that the two were in league with the killer. The killer asked Encred if he was surprised. A persistent lover never forgets his prey. When Encred saw the killer's face, he realized that the half-elf was sent by Aspen in revenge for the destruction of witchcraft. He was gagged and could not even call for help. Having taken Encred away, both soldiers decided that the task was completed. Now Encred remembered where he had heard the names of these soldiers. Jackson, Vel, and Rotten, those scouts that Christ said were cursed and wounded. He remembered this moment well. So they used this as an excuse to leave the reconnaissance team and contact Aspen. Encred's body was discovered by a woman who screamed loudly. People began to run to the scene. Encred's last thought was that now things were going to get very interesting. He woke up in a cold barracks to Ram's curses. On the street, Odin was dousing himself with water from a bucket. Encred called him and asked what Odin said about training that warms the body. This is a bare-handed workout. It is needed so that the body does not become numb in such weather. And with such training you can be prepared for any situation. Encred saw exactly how the killer took out a knife, but his body was numb from the cold and could not react correctly. He asked Odin to show him everything he knew. One showed him one of the exercises, and Encred began to perform it with effort. He should have suspected something was wrong when Jackson and Vel got so close, but if he had knocked them out, the half-elf would have fled. And again he met with these two villains. Encred decided that he would beat them one by one, and said out loud that he was glad to meet them. They were getting closer and closer to the guy. But thanks to Odin, Encred felt that his body was in excellent shape. The figure of a half-elf killer appeared. With one swift movement, Encred pushed Jackson and Vela away from him. Vel angrily drew his sword. He didn't expect Encred to notice their actions and was angry. Encred waited to see what the half-elf would do. Run away or join his accomplices. The guy needed to deal with these two as quickly as possible, and he also took out his sword. But the killer did not approach the fighters. He simply threw a dagger at Encred. The blade pierced the guy's back and pierced him through. The half-elf was a master. Only a specialist can throw a throwing knife from such a distance through a crowd and hit the target. The killer said again that a stubborn lover never forgets his prey. When Encred heard the sound of a flying knife, it had already pierced his heart. Passers-by raised a cry, and Encred thought that he would have to fight in close and ranged combat at the same time. Where should he start preparing? If the half-elf manages to get close, he will stab Encred with a knife. If not, he will throw the knife from afar. These are pretty simple tactics. This wall is relatively simple. The main thing is not to die while training with Odin. Encred was already dying of fatigue. Ragna and Rem watched as the commander trained his endurance for torture. Ram became interested and said that there was nothing complicated here. When Jackson entered the barracks, he saw that everyone there, including the Panther, had joined in the training. Jackson looked at all this with an unreadable expression on his face. He had known for a long time that everyone around him was idiots. After training, Encred drew the shape of a half-elf knife on the ground. It is an order of magnitude higher than ordinary knives in terms of sharpness and speed. Jackson quietly approached the commander and said that it was a whistling dagger. It is so called because of the noise it makes when thrown. It is better to avoid them. If the enemy is a master, you will die before you realize it. Encred half thought that it would be enough to stop this knife thrower in advance. The half-elf was approaching them again. Encred threw away his enemies and grabbed Vel, who could no longer move, by the chest. He was going to use Vela as a shield against the knife. There was a hanging sound and 3 knives stuck into Encred and his opponents. Jackson was also killed. In such a short moment, the half-elf was able to throw 3 knives and hit 3 targets. Does he remove teammates if they are useless? Or does he have no sense of camaraderie at all? The killer leaned over Encred and said that his tenacity was impressive. A persistent lover will never forget his prize. Encred joked that he was very happy. The killer was surprised that the guy was joking before his death and pulled the knife out of Encred's wound. The guy realized that he had taken the next wall too lightly. The boatman in the fog grumbled that Encred was still having fun, but the curse is called a curse for a reason. The joy from it is commensurate with despair. Morning came, Encred opened his eyes, and he immediately went to Jackson to find out everything about the whistling daggers. It turned out that they consist of several layers of thin blades. This is where the unusual whistle comes from when throwing. It was once called a knife that leaves only sound, because its speed is impossible for the human eye to follow. Encred asked what to do if he wants to see the whistling dagger in order to dodge. Jackson replied that Encred would never be able to do that. Encred insisted that he absolutely had to do this. Jackson replied that there was no point in trying to see a knife that had already been thrown. To see, you need to follow the movements of your hands. One way or another, the movement of the knife is determined by the fingertips. There is, of course, a technique for hiding a throw, but if you know it, it's easy to see the hidden movement. Encred asked, with his level, he can master this technique. Jackson realized that he couldn't get away with it, and offered to teach Encred how to throw knives. Jackson was never the first to suggest anything, and it was strange, but Encred confidently said that he would definitely learn. Once again he was on patrol through the city. Encred recalled Jackson's teaching that the throw is a moment. You need to concentrate all the strength of your body in the moment and throw. The same goes for dodging. Seeing the half-elf from afar, Encred cut off Jackson's head with one move of his sword, and he killed Vela, who did not understand anything. People on the street screamed in horror. The killer was approaching. A knife flashed in his hands. Encred wanted to protect the heart, to avoid instant death and focus on the opponent's fingers. He put forward his hand with the sword, and the knife stuck into his hand. The next knife hit him in the chest, and Encred fell to the ground. But he was glad that, albeit for a short moment, he saw a ray of light flash for a split second. When the half-elf approached him, Encred said that he knew everything about his persistent lover. The killer was very surprised. Encred decided that a couple more times, and he would be able to see right through the half-elf's attacks. They will see each other again. Encred got rid of the two traitors as quickly as possible. Jackson was killed by a blow to the throat. Fel also offered no resistance. Encred was no longer the same person as before. He clearly saw the knife in the hands of the killer, which flew into the iron bracer on Encred's hand. The killer swung a second knife. He didn't expect the victim to be so smart and crazy, and Encred attacked the enemy unexpectedly and quickly. The half-elf spun the knife on his finger. Encred realized that this was a deceptive movement, but he couldn't react so quickly and the knife stuck into him. The guy pulled the knife out of the wound on his chest. This weapon was so beautiful that Encred wanted to possess it. The next day he spun the knife on his finger, and he threw it at an apple standing on a stand. Jackson approached him and asked what the commander was doing. Encred replied that he was throwing the slotted dagger. Jackson noticed that Encred's weapon was not a slotted dagger at all, but an ordinary knife. Encred spun the knife on his finger and said that he would soon have an important meeting. At this time, the rope by which Encred was twisting the knife broke, and the knife flew straight at Jackson. It was awkward. On the 8th day, the killer threw 2 knives at the victim. Now the main thing for Encred was not to be deceived by a false attack, and to calculate the time in time. But he was interrupted by an arrow fired from a crossbow into his back. This means there is another bastard who is put in the top position to deal with unforeseen situations. On the 9th day, Encred could hit an apple with a knife. Encred already knew that the throw is launched with the hand and forearm, using the movement of the entire body. Is there anything else he's missing? Jackson replied that everything was correct, and asked where the commander learned to throw knives like that. Encred couldn't tell the guy that he had learned from him. He replied that he watched the masters and learned. Jackson thought the commander was a genius if he learned only by watching. He asked if Encred had listened to something about the Tangam style. This technique was created by the famous assassin Jor. He sought to create a silent sword with one sharp and thin blade. The whistling dagger is a modified version of that silent sword. The Encred stance is considered ideal for working with this type of throwing weapon. On the 10th day, Encred turned around to patrol other streets. To Jackson and Vela's surprise, they were outraged. But Encred reminded them that he was the eldest and took responsibility for changing the patrol route. They had to obey and crawled after Encred, whining that it was time to return to the market. But Encred wasn't going to make their job any easier. He led his accomplices to a desert area and directly asked what they received for their betrayal. A bag of golden crowns? The villains realized that they had been discovered and attacked Encred to kill him. It was very easy for Encred to deal with them, but before he could finish with the 2 traitors, he saw that a half-elf and a man with a crossbow were approaching him. Encred said that he had been waiting for them for a long time, and they could not be shy and attack together. The half-elf threw 3 knives at once. Encred watched him closely and threw himself on the ground to avoid the blow. He moved very quickly, and the crossbowman could not catch the moment to release the arrow. A knife from Encred flew into the crossbowman's forehead. At the same time, the next whistling dagger stuck into Encred's iron bracer. The half-elf did not understand what was happening, and how this bastard could intercept his weapon like that. Encred pulled out a dagger and asked the half-elf how many of these beautiful blades he still had left. The half-elf decided that he and this guy were on the same page and answered that he was 2. Encred said he was jealous of him because he only had 1, which he pulled out of his hand. The half-elf made sure he was dealing with a madman. He will kill him anyway. But Encred objected that the outcome of the battle is only clear when it is over. Even if the opponent hides his hands, it is impossible to completely hide their movements. Dodging without letting the enemy out of sight is the blizzard sense. The half-elf released 2 knives at once, but Encred dodged them. He threw the knife back, but the killer managed to dodge. And of course he had more knives in stock. The killer laughed wickedly. Encred spun his knife on his finger, and he threw it at the enemy with all his might. The half-elf with an effort dodged the blade flying at him. He didn't expect Encred to have extra knives. Having lost his head with rage, the killer drew his sword and rushed to attack the guy. Encred noted the unusual low stance and rapid movements of the enemy. It was a shame to come this far only to encounter a new danger. He grabbed the killer's sword hand. The half-elf's face showed despair. Having disarmed the enemy, Encred blew off his head. It took him 10 days to overcome this wall. Fight, suffer defeat, become stronger again and win. It's crazy fun. The half-elf's knives caught his attention. There were many more. The company commander talked with Encred, who came to her with a report. Did he foresee the assassination attempt and therefore changed his patrol route? Encred swore it was an accident. The killer's knives were already with him. The elf asked if the fact that he fought with 4 killers and received several scratches was also an accident. Encred confidently said that the goddess of luck helped him. The elf was speechless from such impudence, but she had no choice but to let her subordinate go. Encred went back to the barracks, but before he could enter, he was met by an axe flying towards his forehead. Encred calmly dodged the blade, and he attacked Ram, who joyfully said that soon the assassins would come to them and everyone needed to train. Encred threw him a hot stone, which he remembered all this time and wished Ram to choke on it. After that, he decided to cut his hair. The role of their hairdresser went to Kreis, and he charged a lot of money for a haircut, 8 coppers. Kreis told everyone that if they weren't happy with the price, they could get their hair cut at the city barber's. It began to snow, and Encred's entire squad cursed the weather at all costs. Encred wondered how long ago Jackson, Vel, and Roten had joined the ranks of spies. How could the killer penetrate the security zone? Someone is definitely behind this. He asked Kreis if he knew these 3. Where are they from? Kreis said that Jackson was caught stealing, after which he entered the service. Vel slandered the aristocrat. Roten was a security guard for a failed trade guild. They all entered service a year ago at the same time. They seemed to work in the same guild. Encred thought about it. There is one place where the composition just changed at this time. It was a thieves' guild. In fact, it was a den of bandits. This is the most plausible option, given that they are familiar with all the loopholes in the city. Encred asked Jackson if he knew anyone in the thieves' guild. Jackson responded that after the Reformation he severed all ties with the guild, and he told the commander that he needed to leave. Ram shouted indignantly that Jackson did not want to clear the snow and was evading. Encred invited his squad to make a strategic sortie. Ram was ready to speak right away. Jackson agreed to join. Kreis was already ready to leave. Nobody wanted to clear the snow. But first it was necessary to obtain permission from the company commander. The elf immediately understood what Encred's plan was. He suspects that the Thieves Guild is involved in the assassination attempt and wants to destroy them. The elf asked Encred, "Are you sure it's not that his squad doesn't want to shovel the snow?" Looking honestly into her eyes, Encred assured her that this was definitely not the case. And I thought to myself that the company commander was very quick-witted.